Section 1. Introduction. The warnings nobody wanted to hear. There is a version of The Simpsons that most people have never actually watched. They think they have. The Simpsons that most people have never actually watched. They think they have. They've seen the episodes. They know the characters. They can recite the jokes. They remember the couch gags and the chalkboard openings, and the moment Homer disappears backward into the hedge. They've been watching this show for decades, some of them since before they were old enough to understand what a nuclear power plant was. And they feel like they know Springfield the way you know your own neighborhood. Familiar, comfortable, safe. But there is another version of this show running underneath the one everybody thinks they know. A version where the jokes are not just jokes, where the background details are not just background details, where the things the characters say in passing, the throwaway lines, the gags that get a laugh and then disappear, were never throwaway at all. They were warnings. The Simpsons has been airing since the 17th of December, 1989. In the time this show has been on television, the Berlin Wall fell, the internet was born, the entire social and economic architecture of the Western world was dismantled and rebuilt at least twice. And through all of it, through every cultural earthquake and generational shift, this cartoon family sat on their orange couch in Springfield and showed us exactly what was happening. They showed us the economic anxiety eating away at the middle class. They showed us the mental health crisis hiding behind suburban normalcy. They showed us the way corporations hollow out communities while the people inside those communities look the other way. They showed us the collapse of local journalism and the rise of propaganda dressed as entertainment. They showed us the way education gets starved of funding, while the people responsible for starving it give speeches about how much they care about children. They showed us all of it, week after week, season after season, for 36 years, and we laughed. We laughed because it was funny. We laughed because Homer falling down the stairs is objectively one of the funniest things ever put on television. We laughed because the show is brilliant and warm, and the characters feel like family, and the jokes land with a precision that most comedy writers spend their entire careers chasing without ever catching. We laughed, and we changed the channel, and we went to work on Monday morning, and we lived the lives the show had been warning us about without ever making the connection. That is what this video is about. Tonight, we are going to walk through the warnings, every major category of alarm that The Simpsons raised across its run. The economic warnings, the mental health warnings, the environmental warnings, the corporate power warnings, the media warnings, the education warnings, the family structure warnings, the political warnings, the technology warnings, the community and loneliness warnings. We are going to look at what the show was actually saying, what the real-world evidence says in response, and what it means that the most watched animated series in the history of television spent decades screaming the truth at us inside a format so entertaining that nobody felt the need to take it seriously. This is not a conspiracy theory video. This is not about predictions or time travel or the writers somehow knowing the future. The writers did not know the future. They knew the present. They knew it extremely well because the people who wrote The Simpsons at its peak were among the most educated, most culturally attuned, most analytically gifted comedy writers ever assembled in one place. They were reading the same economic reports and social studies and news stories that everyone else had access to. They just did something most people were not doing. They paid attention, they followed the threads. They asked what happens if this trend continues, if this dynamic gets worse, if this problem goes unaddressed for another decade. And then they wrote the answer into jokes and dressed it in yellow skin and four-fingered hands and sent it out to 40 million viewers every Sunday night. The gap between what the show was saying and what audiences heard is the whole story, so settle in. Find a comfortable position, let the lights go low, and let the voice carry you through Springfield one more time. Except this time we are not going to look at the jokes. We are going to look at what the jokes were covering, what The Simpsons understood about America, and what America chose to keep laughing about instead of fixing is one of the most quietly devastating stories in the history of popular culture. And it begins, as so many stories about America begin, with money. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. It genuinely does not matter if it is 2 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning. There are people watching this from every time zone imaginable, and something about knowing that is one of the better feelings in a world that mostly makes you feel like you are alone. Drop your location, drop your time, and if you want to keep getting this kind of deep dive, subscribe. It takes about 2 seconds and it means we can keep making these. Now, Springfield. The show premiered on the 17th of December 1989. That date matters more than most people register, because 1989 is not just a year on a calendar, it is the threshold. It is the last moment before the economic logic that would define the next 3 decades snapped fully into place. The Cold War was ending. The Dow Jones was climbing. The idea that prosperity was permanent, that the middle class was a permanent feature of the American landscape rather than a historical anomaly created by specific post-war conditions, had calcified into conventional wisdom. People were not worried. People were comfortable. People were buying things. And into that comfort, into that certainty, into that confidence that everything was basically fine and getting better, walked the Simpsons family. Homer Simpson works at a nuclear power plant. He has a wife, 3 kids, a dog, a house in the suburbs with a mortgage, and a car that barely runs. He drinks beer at a bar run by a man named Mo. He eats donuts. He watches television. He is, by the show's own description, a normal man leading a normal life in a normal American town. And from the very first episode, the show is very careful to show you exactly how precarious that normality is. The Simpsons' first Christmas is about Homer not being able to afford presents. The family is going to have a bleak holiday because Homer did not get a Christmas bonus, and Bart came home with a tattoo that cost Marge the money she had been saving. Homer takes a job as a department store Santa. He makes almost nothing. He takes his small earnings to a dog track in a desperate attempt to multiply them, and loses. The only reason the episode ends happily is because the dog Homer bets on, the dog that comes in last, becomes the family pet. They go home with a dog instead of presents. And the family is happy about this because the family is used to making do. That is the very first episode of The Simpsons. A working man who cannot afford Christmas, gambling what little he has in a last-ditch attempt to provide for his family, and coming home empty-handed. The show did not start with a joke. It started with a warning, and we have been laughing ever since. What makes the show's economic commentary so precise is not that it predicted specific events. It is that it understood the underlying architecture of financial precarity in a way that most mainstream media at the time was actively refusing to acknowledge. The idea that the American middle class was structurally vulnerable, that the post-war prosperity was dependent on conditions that were eroding in real time, that the dream of a house and a car and a stable job and a retirement was becoming inaccessible for more and more people, while the people at the top continued to accumulate, was not the dominant narrative of 1989 or 1990 or 1995. The dominant narrative was that things were good and getting better. The Simpsons kept showing you Homer's bank account. We will get deep into the economics in the next section. But first, it is worth spending a moment on what made the warnings so easy to ignore. The answer is Homer himself. Homer Simpson is the reason the warnings went unheard, because Homer is one of the most lovable characters in the history of television, and it is very difficult to feel a sense of alarm about the situation of someone who makes you laugh that hard. Homer falling, Homer eating, Homer reacting to bad news with a drawn-out groan that somehow perfectly captures every human experience of mild but genuine suffering. Homer's love for his family in those quiet moments when the comedy steps back and lets the emotion through. These things did not just make The Simpsons entertaining. They made Homer a person you rooted for, a person you wanted to be okay, a person whose circumstances you absorbed with affection rather than concern. But here is the thing. The show always knew this. The writers knew that Homer's lovability was the mechanism that allowed them to say uncomfortable things to a mass audience. Homer being lovable meant you would stay in the room while the show told you things you did not want to hear. The genius of it was that by the time you realized the show had been showing you something real, you were already emotionally invested. You could not look away. Springfield was your home too, in some way you could not quite articulate, and the things happening in Springfield were not quite as fictional as you had been telling yourself. Marge Simpson is another carrier of warning that gets missed because of how she is framed. The show often positions Marge as the voice of reason, the emotional anchor, the one who holds the family together through the force of her patience and her love and her willingness to keep trying even when everything around her is falling apart. She is frequently played as the straight man to Homer's chaos. And because she is the straight man, because she is calm and measured and reasonable, what she says tends to slip past the comedic filter. But listen to what Marge is actually saying. Across the run of the show, Marge repeatedly confronts the reality that her life is not what she wanted it to be. She wanted to be an artist. She wanted to be a police officer. She wanted to have a career, ambitions, an identity outside of her role as a wife and mother. In episode after episode, she tries. She becomes a real estate agent. She joins the police force. She opens a pretzel business. She paints. She writes. And in episode after episode, the circumstances of her life pull her back. The family needs her. The money runs out. The opportunity closes. She returns to the house on Evergreen Terrace and puts the ambition away for another day. The show plays this as episodic. Each attempt at independence is its own contained story, with its own resolution. But across the entire run, the pattern is unmistakable. Marge has spent 36 years sacrificing her own development for the stability of a family that frequently does not notice the sacrifice. The show does not editorialize about this heavily. It shows it to you and moves on. But the cumulative picture, across hundreds of episodes, is of a woman whose potential has been systematically consumed by circumstance. And the show knew that this was not a story unique to Marge. It was happening in living rooms everywhere. It was happening in the homes of the people watching. Lisa Simpson is perhaps the most concentrated warning in the entire cast. Lisa is 8 years old. She is a genius. She plays jazz saxophone with genuine emotional depth. She is the most intellectually serious character on the show, the one most likely to read the situation clearly and articulate what is wrong, and she is consistently, relentlessly, almost systematically ignored by her family, by her school, by her town. Her intelligence is acknowledged but not valued. Her concerns are heard but not acted upon. Her vision of a better Springfield, a better world, a better way of doing things, is received with a mixture of affection and condescension that never quite tips into genuine engagement. And here is the warning buried in Lisa's story. The show is telling you that the system does not reward clarity. The system does not reward intelligence or ethical seriousness or a genuine desire to improve things. The system rewards compliance. The system rewards Homer, who is cheerfully, catastrophically incompetent, because Homer never threatens the structures that keep everyone in their place. Lisa threatens those structures every time she opens her mouth, and her reward for that is isolation. Every generation has its Lisas. The people who see what is happening and name it clearly and get told they are overthinking things, that they are too serious, that they should learn to relax. The Simpsons built that archetype into the DNA of the show and placed her in a family that loves her but cannot quite follow her, in a town that tolerates her but does not listen, and let her run for 36 seasons without anyone ever saying, "You know what? Maybe she has a point." Bart is a different kind of warning. Bart is the warning about what happens to boys who are bored. Bart is 10 years old, and he is creative and physically daring and socially charismatic, and absolutely nothing in his environment is designed to engage those qualities productively. His school is underfunded and poorly run. His teachers range from exhausted to actively disengaged. His home life is warm but chaotic. He has no productive outlet for the energy and intelligence and appetite for stimulation that defines his character, so he directs all of it outward in the form of pranks and mischief, and behavior that adults interpret as defiance. The show presents Bart's rebelliousness as a character trait, as something innate to who he is, and there is truth in that framing. But the show also, carefully and consistently, shows you the environment that shaped him. It shows you Springfield Elementary as it actually is. It shows you the classroom he sits in, the lessons he is asked to endure, the gap between what he is capable of and what the institution asks of him. Bart is not a bad kid. He is a kid who was handed nothing to do and filled the vacuum with chaos because chaos, at least, was interesting. That warning lands differently in 2024 than it did in 1989. Because in 1989, the idea that schools were underfunding creative and engaged learning was a concern. Now it is a documented crisis. The research on student disengagement, on the failure of standardized curriculum to reach certain kinds of learners, on the correlation between boredom and behavior problems in classrooms, has accumulated into a body of evidence that would have been recognizable to anyone watching The Simpsons and paying attention to what it was actually showing about Bart. Springfield as a location carries its own set of warnings, separate from any individual character. The town itself is the warning. The way it is designed, the way it functions, the way its institutions relate to each other and to the people inside them, is a precise rendering of a kind of American community that was already in serious trouble by the time the show began and has not gotten better since. Springfield has one major employer, one significant source of economic activity, one entity around which the entire town organizes itself. Economically, politically, socially, the nuclear power plant owned by Mr. Burns is not just a workplace. It is the beating heart of Springfield's economy, and the fact that it is owned by a single individual who operates it with no meaningful oversight and no genuine accountability is not played as a dystopian premise. It is played as normal. It is Springfield. It is just how things are. But the show also shows you what just how things are actually means in practice. It means that when Burns wants to do something that is bad for the town, he does it, because the town's economic survival depends on the plant's continued operation, and that dependency gives Burns leverage that no democratic process can meaningfully counterbalance. It means that when Homer tries to organize labor action or raise safety concerns or challenge the conditions at the plant, the show of force is immediate and total. It means that the people of Springfield have traded their autonomy, their health, their political agency for the security of a paycheck. And the paycheck keeps coming, so nobody looks too hard at the cost. That is the story of every one-company town in America. It is the story of communities built around a single industry or a single employer that discover, usually too late, that they have organized their entire existence around something they have no control over. The Simpsons showed you this structure, showed you how it worked, showed you the human cost of it, and dressed it in enough jokes that nobody in the audience felt the need to call it by its real name. There is a reason this show lasted 36 seasons. There is a reason it accumulated over 700 episodes. There is a reason it penetrated more deeply into American popular culture than almost any other piece of media ever created. It is not just that it was funny, though it was. It is that it was true. It was showing people their own lives reflected back at them through a prism that made the reflection bearable. That made it possible to sit with the discomfort of recognizing something real without having to act on the recognition. The show was the pressure valve. It let people feel seen without feeling responsible. It let people laugh at the absurdity of their own situation without ever quite arriving at the question of what to do about it. And that, as much as anything else in Springfield's story, is the warning we most need to sit with. Because the show is still on. The family is still on the couch. Homer is still going to work every day at the plant, still getting paid by the man who poisoned his water, still coming home to a neighborhood that has been quietly hollowed out, while everyone inside it looks the other way. And we are still watching. And we are still laughing. The question this video is asking is not whether The Simpsons was right about America. It clearly was. The question is what we are supposed to do with that knowledge. Now that we have it, now that we can look back across 36 seasons of warnings and trace the line between what the show said was happening and what the evidence shows actually happened, there is no clean answer to that question. There is no final scene where The Simpsons fix Springfield and the credits roll on a better world. The show never offered that, because the show understood something about the problems it was depicting that most of us are still learning. These problems do not have single episodes. They have seasons. They have accumulation. They compound, they interact, and they do not get solved by one family in one town, no matter how lovable that family is. What the show offered instead was attention. Sustained, generous, funny, warm attention to the things that were going wrong, delivered in a format that people would actually watch. It was the longest-running warning system in the history of American entertainment. And the warnings were good. The warnings were accurate. The warnings were embedded in storylines and character details and background jokes with such precision that you could write a graduate thesis on any single one of them and find more than enough material. The problem was never the warnings. The problem was who was listening. Let us start with money. Section 2. The economy. Warning Springfield's financial rot. Homer Simpson's salary has never been officially confirmed at a precise number across the entire run of the show. The writers were deliberate about this. Different episodes imply different income levels. Sometimes Homer seems comfortable. Sometimes the family is clearly stretched. Sometimes a medical bill or a car repair or a failed business venture sends the household into a financial tailspin that resolves by the next episode. The show's floating timeline means that the economic reality of the Simpsons family shifts depending on what the story needs. But there is a detail that appears across many episodes that is worth anchoring to. Homer works as a safety inspector at a nuclear power plant. In the real world, nuclear plant workers with Homer's apparent level of seniority and job classification would earn somewhere in the range of $60,000 to $80,000 a year, depending on the state and the specific facility. This is a reasonable middle-class income. It is not wealthy. It is not struggling. It is the thing that was supposed to be normal, the thing that was supposed to be enough, the thing that the whole architecture of the American dream was designed around. A steady job with a steady paycheck, a house in a neighborhood with good schools, a car in the driveway, enough left over at the end of the month for a beer at Moe's and a vacation once a year. That was the deal. That was what post-war America had promised to working people in exchange for their labor and their loyalty and their willingness to show up every day at a job that was sometimes dangerous and sometimes demeaning, but always, crucially, available. Homer has all of this. And across 36 seasons, the show meticulously documents every way in which it is not enough. Start with the house. The Simpsons live at 742 Evergreen Terrace. It is a two-story home in a residential neighborhood. It has a yard. It has a garage. By the visible standards of the 1990s American suburb, it is a perfectly ordinary family home. And across hundreds of episodes, it becomes a ledger of financial stress. The roof leaks, the furnace breaks, the car needs repairs that Homer either cannot afford or delays until they become catastrophic. There are episodes built entirely around the family's inability to pay an unexpected bill. There are episodes about the mortgage. There are episodes where Homer takes a second job, or a third job, or starts a side business in a desperate attempt to generate the extra income that his primary salary consistently fails to provide. The show portrays the financial life of the American middle class with an accuracy that was almost uncomfortable to watch, even in the 1990s, and has only gotten more pointed with time. Because what The Simpsons' finances depict is not poverty. It is something arguably more anxiety-producing than poverty, because it looks like stability from the outside while feeling like standing on ice from the inside. Homer makes enough to maintain the appearance of a middle-class life. He does not make enough to feel secure. There is always one emergency away from crisis. There is always a calculation happening just below the surface of daily life about what can be deferred, what can be ignored, what has to be dealt with right now, and what can wait until the next paycheck. This experience, the experience of income that is technically sufficient but perpetually fragile, is one of the defining economic realities of the last 40 years. The term precariat was coined by economists in the 1980s to describe workers whose economic situations were more precarious than their apparent employment status suggested. Homer Simpson is a textbook precariat before the term had fully entered the conversation. He has a job. He has benefits. He has a house with a mortgage and a family with needs. And the gap between what he has and what he would need to feel genuinely secure is the gap the show lives in, the gap that generates the financial plots, the gap that makes the economic comedy land with the specific weight of recognition, Mr. Burns is the other side of this equation, and the show is very deliberate about showing both sides in the same frame. Burns is worth billions. He lives in a mansion. He has servants. He has lawyers and doctors and an entire infrastructure of wealth that insulates him from every consequence that Homer cannot escape. And he is Homer's employer. These two men are in a direct economic relationship. Homer's labor generates value that flows upward to Burns. Burns's decisions about wages, about safety, about working conditions flow downward to Homer. The structure of the relationship is the structure of the economy. The show never lets you forget this. It keeps putting Homer and Burns in the same room, keeps showing you the vast distance between them, keeps finding ways to make that distance legible and human, rather than abstract. In one episode, Burns cannot remember Homer's name despite Homer having worked for him for years. This is played as a recurring comic bit. Burns keeps almost getting it and missing. He cycles through wrong names. He describes Homer as that simpleton or reaches for what's his name. And it is funny, genuinely funny, because the specific quality of the joke, the way it captures Burns's complete disregard for the individual humanity of his employees, is executed with real comedic precision. But it is also a precise description of the psychological experience of being economically subordinate. The person whose decisions control your financial life does not know your name. To them, you are a function. You are a role. You are the safety inspector in Sector 7G, a position that could be filled by any number of people and whose specific occupant is largely irrelevant to the calculations being made in the corner office. You show up, you perform the function. The value you generate flows upward. Whether you are called Homer or Harold or Henry is a detail beneath notice. The show explored the practical mechanics of economic vulnerability in ways that were specific and grounded. Season 4's episode where Homer attempts to take on a second job as a telemarketer, Season 5's subplot about the family losing their house, the various plots about Homer's attempts to supplement his income through schemes that invariably fail, these were not random premise generators. They were a systematic documentation of what it looked like to be working class in an economy that was slowly withdrawing the supports that had made working class life viable. The real-world context for all of this is one of the most significant and most underreported economic stories of the last half-century. Between the end of World War II and approximately 1973, worker productivity and worker wages in the United States grew at roughly the same rate. When the economy got more productive, workers benefited proportionally. This was not an accident. It was the result of specific policies, specific labor organizing victories, specific social contracts between employers and employees that had been established through decades of struggle. After 1973, those lines diverged. Productivity continued to grow. Wages stopped growing at the same rate. The gap between what workers produced and what workers were paid began to widen. Slowly at first, then accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s and into the 2000s. By the time The Simpsons had been on the air for 20 years, the gap between productivity growth and wage growth had become one of the most documented economic phenomena in the academic literature. The research showed it clearly. The workers who were creating more value were not capturing more of that value. The value was going somewhere else. It was going to Burns. The show's depiction of Springfield's single employer, single economic center dynamic also captured something specific about the geography of American economic decline. Springfield is a company town. Not literally, in the way that some historical towns were entirely owned and operated by a single corporation, but functionally, the plant is the economic engine. The plant provides the jobs that generate the spending that supports the businesses that create the tax base, that funds the schools and the roads and the government services. Everything connects back to the plant. And the plant is owned by one man who cannot remember the name of the person he is most financially dependent on for his continued operation. This dynamic, the concentration of economic power in a single entity whose decisions have outsized consequences for an entire community, became more rather than less common in the decades after The Simpsons began. Walmart moved into towns that previously had diverse local economies and reorganized those economies around itself, often ultimately hollowing out the very commercial ecosystems that had existed before it arrived. Amazon reshaped retail logistics in ways that made entire categories of local employment obsolete. Tech companies concentrated wealth in a handful of metropolitan areas, while other regions stagnated. The story of American economic geography from 1989 to the present is a story of concentration, of resources and opportunity pooling in fewer and fewer places and around fewer and fewer entities. While the places and people who fall outside that concentration watch their options narrow, Springfield showed you this. Springfield showed you what it looked like to live inside an economy built around a single center of power. It showed you the dependency and the vulnerability and the way that dependency shapes behavior, shapes politics, shapes the individual choices people make every day about what they are willing to tolerate in exchange for the security of the paycheck continuing to arrive. Homer never leaves the plant. This is a fact that gets treated as a given, a fixed point in Springfield's geography. Of course, Homer works at the plant. Where else would he work? The show occasionally plays with the premise of Homer doing other things, taking other jobs, trying other paths, but these are always temporary. The plant is always where he ends up. And the show never quite asks the question of why, never quite surfaces the examination of what would have to be true about Homer's options and Homer's psychology and the economic structure of Springfield for the plant to be the inevitable destination it keeps being. But the answer is visible in the background of every episode. Homer keeps coming back to the plant because the plant is where the job is, and in Springfield there is essentially only one place where the jobs are. He keeps coming back because the mortgage requires the paycheck, and the paycheck requires the job, and the job is at the plant. He keeps coming back because leaving would mean going somewhere, and going somewhere would mean accepting an uncertainty that the fragile stability of his current situation, for all its costs, at least resolves. Better the devil you know. Better the boss who does not know your name than the void of not knowing where the next paycheck comes from. The show also captured something important about the relationship between economic vulnerability and political disengagement. Springfield holds elections. Springfield has a mayor. Springfield has a town council and a school board and an array of civic institutions that should, in theory, create accountability for the people making decisions that affect everyone's lives. In practice, these institutions are captured. Mayor Quimby is corrupt in a way so obvious and so completely tolerated that it has become part of the town's ambient reality. The school board is ineffectual. The police are somewhere between incompetent and actively self-interested. The democratic structures that exist to give regular people leverage over the conditions of their lives function in Springfield the way they function in many real communities, as theater. The connection between economic precarity and political disengagement is well documented in the research literature. People who are working multiple jobs to maintain a household have less time to attend town council meetings. People who are financially stressed are more susceptible to political messaging that promises simple solutions to complex problems. People who feel that the institutions designed to represent them have consistently failed to do so develop a generalized distrust that makes genuine civic engagement feel pointless. And people who are economically dependent on a single large employer are often reluctant to challenge that employer in political contexts because the risk of economic retaliation is too great. Springfield residents are all of these things simultaneously. They are overworked and underpaid and dependent on Burns and represented by officials who are indifferent or actively hostile to their interests, and they are disengaged in a specific way. They show up for the drama. They attend the town meetings when something exciting is happening. They riot when the right trigger is pulled. But they do not organize. They do not build. They do not create the kind of sustained, coherent political pressure that would be necessary to actually change the conditions they are living in. This, too, is a warning. The show's economic humor had a specific register that is worth naming. It was not the humor of contempt, the kind that mocks poor people for being poor, or working-class people for being crude or unsophisticated. The Simpsons was genuinely fond of its characters in their financial struggle. Homer eating a day-old sandwich and finding it delightful. Marge stretching the grocery budget with impressive, creative resourcefulness. Bart finding ways to have fun that cost nothing. The humor was warm and recognizing, the humor of someone who has lived inside financial constraint and found the specific textures of it worth depicting with affection. But beneath the warmth was a clear-eyed recognition that the constraint was real, that it shaped people, that it limited them in ways they could not always see and rarely articulated directly. The show understood that economic insecurity is not just an inconvenience. It is an environment. It is the water you swim in. It shapes your relationship to risk, to authority, to your own sense of what is possible. It shapes the choices you make about your children's education, your own ambitions, your willingness to challenge the people and structures that hold power over your life. Homer Simpson making $70,000 a year and still feeling perpetually one crisis away from disaster is one of the most important economic portraits in the history of American popular culture. It told the truth about what the middle class actually felt like from the inside, at a moment when the official story of American prosperity insisted that everything was fine. Everything was not fine. The Simpsons knew this in 1989, and it kept saying so. In every episode where Homer agonized over a bill, in every subplot about the family's mortgage, in every scene where Burns made a decision that affected Homer's life and did not register that Homer existed, The economy the show depicted was not a fictional exaggeration of American capitalism. It was a fairly accurate portrait of what American capitalism was doing to working families in real time. The wages that were not growing with productivity, the benefits that were being eroded, the pensions that were disappearing, the health insurance that was becoming more expensive and less comprehensive, the housing costs that were outpacing income growth, the college debt that was beginning to accumulate in ways that would define the financial lives of an entire generation. All of it was there. All of it was in Springfield. The show put it on screen every week and framed it as comedy and called it the story of a normal American family. It was not comedy, it was documentation, and the documentation was accurate. The Simpsons also understood something subtle about aspiration and its relationship to economic reality. The show was populated with characters who wanted more than they had, who reached for things that were slightly beyond their grasp, who invested enormous energy in schemes and plans and second jobs and lottery tickets and investment opportunities that almost never worked out. Homer's basement business ventures, Ned Flanders' various entrepreneurial attempts, Moe's periodic efforts to turn the tavern into something more respectable. These characters were not stupid. They were responding rationally to an environment where the straightforward path, work hard, save money, get ahead, was no longer producing the outcomes it had once promised. When the legitimate path stops working, people find other paths. Some of those paths are constructive, some of them are not. The Simpsons showed you the full spectrum, from Homer's relatively harmless get-rich-quick schemes to the more pointed depictions of people who were being exploited by the promise of alternatives that were themselves rigged. The show understood that economic desperation creates opportunity for predation. That when people feel the legitimate channels closing, they become susceptible to anyone who claims to have an illegitimate shortcut. This was another warning. The proliferation of payday lending and multi-level marketing schemes and various other financial products designed to extract money from people who did not have enough of it was already underway when The Simpsons was in its early seasons. It accelerated. The show's depictions of Springfield residents being taken advantage of by financial schemes they barely understood were less comic exaggeration than accurate observation. The episode that most clearly crystallizes the economic warning is arguably the monorail episode, which aired in Season 4 and has become one of the most beloved episodes in the show's history. A charismatic con man named Lyle Lanley arrives in Springfield and sells the town on an expensive monorail project that is entirely fraudulent. The town, flush with money from a Burns settlement, falls completely for the pitch. The monorail is built with substandard materials. It nearly destroys Springfield on its inaugural run, and Lyle Lanley is long gone by the time anyone understands what happened. The warning in that episode is about civic decision-making, under conditions of misplaced trust and inadequate information. It is about the way a community in possession of resources can be convinced to waste those resources by someone who understands how to exploit the gap between what people want to believe and what is actually true. It is about the seduction of a compelling narrative over the boring but necessary work of due diligence. It is about grift. It is about the institutional vulnerability that allows grift to succeed. The monorail episode was written in 1993. In the decades since, the specific pattern it depicted, a community being sold an expensive promise by a charismatic figure who profits enormously and leaves before the consequences arrive, has repeated itself so many times and in so many contexts that cataloging the instances would be its own project. Infrastructure projects that did not deliver, financial products that were not what they appeared, political promises that extracted resources and loyalty from communities and produced nothing. The pattern was real. The show named it. And then the show moved on to the next episode, and America moved on too. The economic warnings in The Simpsons are not warnings about a possible future. They are warnings about a present that was already underway. The show was looking at the economy of the late 1980s and early 1990s and describing what it saw with remarkable clarity. The trajectory it was describing, toward greater precarity, toward greater concentration of wealth, toward the erosion of the institutional supports that had made middle-class stability possible, was not a prediction. It was a reading of the current. And the current carried Springfield and America exactly where the reading suggested it would. Homer is still at the plant is still owned by Burns. Burns is still worth billions. Homer still cannot remember exactly when the mortgage is due. And every Sunday night, for 36 years, that was the show. A warning dressed as a sitcom, a ledger dressed as a comedy, a portrait of financial reality so accurate that it was easier to laugh at it than to face it. And we laughed. Section 3. The mental health warning. Everyone in Springfield is suffering. There is a scene in The Simpsons that most people remember as funny and very few people register as devastating. It occurs in an episode where Homer and Marge attend marriage counseling. They are sitting across from a therapist, trying to articulate why their marriage is under strain, and Homer, when asked what he wants from his relationship, thinks for a long moment and then says something that is delivered as a punchline but lands differently if you let it sit. He says he just wants to be happy. The therapist asks him if he is happy. Homer thinks about it again. He takes his time. And then he says he does not know. He says he has been happy before, he thinks, but he cannot quite be sure if what he felt was actually happiness or just the absence of something worse. He says he cannot really tell the difference anymore. The therapist writes something down. The scene moves on. Homer says something ridiculous and the audience laughs and the moment dissolves into the next joke. But the thing Homer said stays. It stays because it is one of the most honest things any character on a network sitcom had said about the interior emotional life of a middle-aged working man in the history of the format. The Simpsons has always been a show about people who are struggling emotionally. This is easy to miss because the show is also very funny, and because the emotional struggling is usually expressed through behavior that reads as comic before it reads as symptomatic. Homer's rage, his compulsive eating, his drinking, his inability to think about the future, his desperate, almost childlike need for validation from the people around him, his relationship with risk, his intermittent capacity for genuine emotional connection, and his much more consistent retreat into television and beer, and the particular numbness of a man who has learned that feeling too much is more painful than the alternative. These are not character quirks. They are clinical presentations. Homer Simpson, described with clinical precision, exhibits a recognizable profile of depression and anxiety managed through avoidance and self-medication. The drinking is not just a joke. The eating is not just a gag. The sleeping at work, the inability to engage with long-term planning, the bursts of irrational anger followed by genuine remorse and genuine affection, the cycling between extremes, these are the things that clinicians describe when they describe certain patterns of emotional dysregulation in adult men. The show never calls any of this by its clinical name. It does not do an episode where Homer is diagnosed with depression and takes medication and learns to manage his symptoms. The show is not that kind of show, but it does something arguably more honest. It shows you the behavior. It shows you what it looks like to be a person who is not doing well emotionally, but who has no language for that fact and no support system equipped to address it. It shows you the family that loves Homer but cannot quite reach him, and the town full of people who are too busy with their own versions of the same problem to notice. Mental health is a thread that runs through almost every significant character in Springfield, and the way the show handles it, with simultaneous compassion and comedy, and a specific refusal to moralize or simplify, is one of the things that makes the show genuinely remarkable. Marge's anxiety is documented from the earliest seasons. She is a worrier. She catastrophizes. She lies awake at night running through scenarios of things that might go wrong. She has a physical response to stress that the show depicts as a hum, a vibration that starts in her chest when the pressure becomes too great. In the episode where Marge's anxiety becomes the central focus, the show reveals that she has always had this quality, that it predates her marriage and her children, that it is something she has been managing since childhood. And the management strategy she has developed is not treatment. It is suppression. It is the decision, made again and again across her life, to put the anxiety somewhere it cannot be seen and keep functioning. Keep smiling, keep being the stable one, so that everyone around her can afford the luxury of being unstable. The cost of that strategy, what it has taken from Marge across 3 decades of managing her own emotional distress in silence so that the family could operate, is something the show acknowledges in specific moments and then moves past. Because the show is always moving past. That is both its limitation and part of its point. The characters do not get to stay in the difficult feeling. They have to keep going. They have to make it to the next scene. And so Marge humming quietly in a house that is about to fall apart, Marge holding herself together through force of will at the expense of everything else, is a recurring image that accumulates over the entire run of the show into something that feels less like comedy and more like testimony. Lisa's emotional situation is one of the most sustained portraits of adolescent depression in the history of television. The show has an episode, the one called Moaning Lisa, that aired in season 1, where Lisa wakes up feeling sad and cannot articulate why. She is not sad about anything specific. She is just sad. The sadness is ambient, pervasive, without a cause she can name. She plays sad music. She wanders through Springfield in a state of low-grade grief. And the adults around her, with the best possible intentions, keep trying to fix her by telling her to cheer up. Marge, wanting her daughter not to suffer, spends an episode coaching Lisa to hide her feelings. She teaches her to smile. She teaches her to perform happiness. She teaches her the social skill of presenting a version of herself to the world that does not alarm people. And Lisa, because she is Lisa, and because she is 8 years old and she loves her mother and she wants to make things easier for the people around her, tries. She tries to perform the happiness she does not feel. And then she encounters a jazz musician who tells her something different. He tells her to feel what she feels. He tells her the sadness is valid. He tells her that music is a container for the things you cannot say any other way. That episode is 35 years old. It aired in 1990. And the clinical understanding of what it depicts, the specific quality of what we would now call depression, a persistent low mood without a clear, precipitating cause, the way well-meaning adults respond by trying to suppress the symptom rather than address the underlying experience, the relief that comes from feeling genuinely seen and told that the feeling is real, has not changed. The only thing that has changed is that we now have more language for it. We have the DSM categories and the treatment protocols and the awareness campaigns. We know more about what to call what Lisa is experiencing. But the experience itself, and the inadequate response it typically receives from the people around the person having it, is the same. The show was showing you this in 1990. It was showing you a child in emotional distress whose distress was being managed into invisibility by people who loved her but did not know how to help. It was showing you the loneliness of that experience, the specific isolation of having something real happening inside you that the people around you are working very hard to make you stop expressing. It was showing you this on network television on a Sunday night to 40 million people, and then it moved on to the next episode, and so did everyone else. Barney Gumble is the character the show uses to explore alcoholism, and the treatment is more serious than the comic framing initially suggests. Barney is Homer's best friend. He is also, by any clinical definition, a severe alcoholic. He lives at the bar. His physical health is clearly compromised. His social world has collapsed to the point where the bar is essentially his entire life. He has no employment, no stable housing, no relationships outside of the network of equally damaged people who occupy Moe's Tavern. He is, in clinical terms, in the late stages of alcohol dependency. The show uses Barney as a running gag. He belches. He falls down. He says things that are funny because they are so disconnected from normal social functioning, and this is effective comedy. Barney's specific quality of self-destruction, the total lack of self-awareness combined with occasional flashes of genuine feeling, makes him a compelling comic figure. But the show also, in several episodes, takes Barney seriously. In the episode where Barney gets sober, where he joins a support program and genuinely tries to change, the show lets you see the person underneath the alcoholism. The person who was always there, who is articulate and creative and capable, who became the person at the bar because something broke inside him and the bar was where the pain was manageable. Barney's sobriety does not last. The show resets him. He goes back to drinking, and the trajectory back to the bar is handled quickly, almost apologetically, as if the show knows it is doing something wrong but cannot find another way to maintain the character's function in Springfield's social ecosystem. This is one of the genuinely troubling aspects of The Simpsons' treatment of mental health and addiction. The show can see the human being inside the behavior. It can show you the cost, the damage, the possibility of something better, and then it puts the behavior back, because the character is needed in a certain form for the jokes to work. But even this, even the reset, contains a truth, because the reset is often what happens. Barney's pattern of getting sober and going back to drinking is not a cartoon convenience. It is a clinical reality for many people dealing with alcohol dependency. The show knew this and depicted it. The show also knew that the environment Barney comes home to when he gets out of rehab, Moe's Tavern, the same people, the same patterns, the same social world built around drinking, is not an environment that supports sustained sobriety. And it let Barney back into that environment without comment. Because Springfield is Springfield and things in Springfield do not change. The show's most sustained exploration of mental health in a clinical rather than comic frame is probably the episode where Marge's gambling addiction becomes the focus. What makes this episode interesting is the specificity with which it depicts addiction and the family system around it. Marge starts gambling at a new casino. The gambling activates something in her that nothing else does. It gives her a sense of control, a sense of agency, a sense of excitement in a life where the daily round of domestic management has slowly crowded out most of the things that once made her feel like herself. The gambling is a symptom of something real about Marge's emotional situation, about the needs she has that are not being met, about the parts of her that have been set aside for so long that she has almost stopped noticing they existed. The show does not let Marge off the hook for the harm her addiction causes. It shows the family's confusion and pain. It shows Homer trying and failing to be supportive. But it also refuses to let the gambling be simply a character flaw. It shows you what the gambling is filling. It shows you the emotional logic of it, why someone who loves her family as sincerely as Marge does would nonetheless find herself unable to stop doing something that is hurting them. That is not simple. That is not a lesson to be learned and applied. That is the complex, structural difficulty of addiction, and the show depicted it with enough honesty that it was uncomfortable to watch. Ned Flanders' mental health situation deserves extended attention. Because Ned is the character who most fully illustrates something the show understood about the relationship between psychological damage and social presentation. Ned appears, to anyone who does not look closely, to be the most mentally healthy person in Springfield. He is cheerful, he is kind, he is patient, he is faith-centered and community-oriented, and genuinely generous. He is, on the surface, a model of functional human behavior. And he is, beneath the surface, a man whose entire psychological architecture was constructed to contain something he was never allowed to express. The episode where this is revealed, the one where Ned has a breakdown and is hospitalized, takes the form of a therapeutic flashback. A psychiatrist who knew Ned as a child describes what happened. Ned was born to parents who were, by the standards of their era, radically progressive in their approach to child rearing. They did not believe in discipline. They did not believe in rules. They let Ned do whatever he wanted, express whatever he felt, live without boundaries. And what emerged from that environment was not a free and healthy child. What emerged was a child who was overwhelmed, who had no ability to regulate himself, who was running on pure impulse in a world that had no structure for him to push against. The child Ned would be recognizable in clinical terms today. He would be assessed, his needs would be identified, appropriate support would be put in place. Instead, he was taken to a psychiatrist who spent years doing something that the show describes as a behavioral modification program. Something that, watching it depicted on screen, looks like sustained aversive conditioning. The rage was conditioned out of Ned. The anger was suppressed. The intensity was redirected into religion, into rigidity, into a performance of goodness so complete that it became Ned's entire identity. And behind that performance, locked in and untreated and occasionally leaking through the cracks, is the original Ned, the feral kid who never got what he actually needed. This is a portrait of what used to be called repression and what we would now describe in somewhat more nuanced terms. But the basic structure is the same. Ned's kindness is not authentic. It is performed, and the performance costs him enormously, and the cost is paid in the specific way that repressed emotional content always extracts payment, through the occasional shattering breakthrough, and through the ambient depression, and through the low-level suffering of a man who is perpetually managing something he does not have language for and has never been allowed to feel. The show understood this. It depicted it, and it surrounded the depiction with so much comedy, so much warm affection for Ned's specific brand of cheerful suffering that the clinical content barely registered. What most people remembered about the Ned breakdown episode was the funny parts. The specific things he said when he lost it, the jokes about his repressed vocabulary, the comedy of a man who has been so thoroughly conditioned against anger, finally letting some of it out in a context where it could only be funny. What the episode was actually doing was showing you a man who needed help and had never gotten it, in a town where no one had the language or the resources or the social framework to provide it. Springfield, as a community, has essentially no functional mental health infrastructure. Dr. Hibbert is a medical doctor but not a specialist in psychological care. The few therapists who appear in the show are parodies. The school counselor, where one exists at all, is depicted as well-meaning but ineffectual. The support structures that research has consistently shown to be important for community mental health, accessible therapy, crisis services, community support networks, programs for at-risk youth, are either absent or depicted as captured by interests that have nothing to do with helping anyone. This is not a fictional exaggeration. This is the mental health landscape of a significant portion of American communities. The therapist shortage in rural and small-town America, the coverage gaps in insurance that make mental health treatment effectively inaccessible for working-class families, the stigma around seeking help that is particularly acute in communities organized around toughness and self-reliance, the inadequacy of school psychological support for kids who need it, these are real and documented problems. Springfield is not making them up. Springfield is showing them to you in a format that allows you to recognize them without having to sit with the discomfort of their being real. Homer's emotional life in particular deserves one more pass, because the show's treatment of his depression, never named as such but consistently depicted, is one of the more precise renderings of male emotional avoidance in popular culture. Homer does not have male friends in the sense of people he talks to. He has a bar where he sits. He has people he spends time with. He has a best friend in Barney, but his relationship with Barney is built around shared activity, shared consumption, the comfortable companionship of people who are not required to express themselves. Homer does not express himself. He eats. He watches television. He occasionally explodes in anger that he immediately regrets. He has intermittent moments of profound emotional openness with Marge, moments where something real breaks through the surface, and he is, briefly, entirely present. And then the moment passes, and he retreats back into the avoidance. The research on male loneliness and male friendship in the United States describes this pattern with near-clinical precision. American men are significantly less likely than American women to maintain close, emotionally intimate friendships in adult life. They are significantly more likely to experience social isolation. The social scripts available to men in American culture around friendship and emotional expression are narrow and often actively unhelpful. The message that men receive from their culture about how to handle emotional difficulty is essentially a variation on the instruction to handle it somewhere private and then come back and be functional. Homer handles it with beer and television and the refrigerator. The show depicts this with such warmth and affection that it is easy to see it as a character quirk rather than a portrait of epidemic male emotional suppression. But it is both. It is a funny character quirk that is also a precise description of a phenomenon that is causing measurable harm to an enormous number of people. The men who are not talking to anyone about what is going on inside them. The men who are managing their interior lives with whatever is available in the refrigerator, or the bar, or the television remote. The men who would describe their emotional state, if pressed, the way Homer described it to that therapist. They have been happy, they think, but they cannot quite be sure. The mental health warnings in The Simpsons were not delivered as warnings. They were delivered as character. They were embedded in the specific, lovable, frustrating, endearing qualities of the people Springfield was made of. And that embedding was so thorough, the comedy so good, the characters so real, that the thing being depicted and the way it was being depicted merged into something that felt like entertainment rather than observation. It was both. Every person in Springfield who was suffering and did not know how to ask for help was showing you a version of a real pattern. Every family that could not communicate past a certain depth, every community that had no language for the emotional dimension of what was happening to it, every culture that had decided that certain kinds of feelings were not appropriate for certain kinds of people, the show knew all of this. The show put it in Springfield, and Springfield put it on the couch, turned on the television, and laughed, just like us. Section 4. The environmental warning. The town knew and did nothing. In season 2 of The Simpsons, a fisherman pulls a three-eyed fish out of a river near the Springfield nuclear power plant. The fish, named Blinky, becomes a news story. A politician uses the fish as evidence that Burns is poisoning the local environment. There are press conferences, there are investigations. The people of Springfield look at this fish with its three eyes, and they understand in the most direct and literal way possible that something in their environment is wrong enough to produce visible mutations in the wildlife that shares it with them. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate that it is harmless. The town accepts this. The investigation goes away. Nobody tests the water. Nobody monitors the river. Nobody asks the obvious follow-up question, which is whether whatever did that to the fish has done anything analogous to the people who have been drinking the same water and breathing the same air for years or decades. Within the first 2 seasons of The Simpsons, the show had depicted what is essentially the complete playbook of environmental harm denial in industrial America. The harm occurs. The harm is visible. The harm is made public. The responsible party performs innocuousness. The investigation is insufficient. The questions stop being asked, and the harm continues. This is not a fictional playbook. This is a documented pattern with a real and extensive history. The story of Flint, Michigan and its water crisis is probably the most widely known American example of this pattern in recent years. The decision to change Flint's water source in 2014, the subsequent lead contamination, the years during which residents raised concerns that were dismissed or minimized by officials, the eventual confirmation that something genuinely harmful had been happening, the belated and incomplete response, all of it follows the same structure as what Springfield depicts with Blinky the three-eyed fish. Visible harm, community concern, official dismissal, continued harm, eventual acknowledgement without adequate remediation. But Flint is one instance of a pattern with many instances. Love Canal in New York, where a neighborhood was built on a toxic waste site and residents lived with alarming rates of illness for years before the contamination was officially acknowledged. Hinckley, California, made famous by the Aaron Brockovich case, where groundwater contamination from a power company caused documented health effects in the community over an extended period. The various Superfund sites scattered across the country, many of them in communities that disproportionately lack the political power to compel cleanup or accountability. The agricultural communities where pesticide application practices have contaminated groundwater. The industrial corridors where communities live downstream from facilities that discharge into rivers or release into air. The pattern is not an aberration. The pattern is the standard operating procedure for a specific kind of relationship between industrial activity, regulatory oversight, and community power. When a community lacks the economic or political resources to compel accountability, when the entity causing harm is the primary source of employment and tax revenue for the community it is harming, when the regulatory infrastructure is underfunded or captured, harm continues. It continues until the harm becomes undeniable, and sometimes it continues past that point. Springfield is a textbook example. The plant has 342 safety violations. The cost of remediation is known, was calculated by the German investors who briefly owned it, and was staggering enough to nearly bankrupt the enterprise of bringing it into compliance. Burns chose not to bring it into compliance. The regulatory framework that should have compelled compliance did not. The safety inspector whose job is to prevent this situation is Homer, a man whose cognitive impairment is itself, in the terms of the radiation theory we discussed in the other video, a consequence of the very contamination he is supposed to be monitoring. The circular trap of it is almost elegant in its completeness. The harm produces the conditions that prevent the harm from being identified and stopped. The contamination produces the cognitive damage that ensures the contaminated person cannot adequately process what the contamination is doing to him. The system sustains itself, but the environmental warnings in The Simpsons extend well beyond the nuclear plant. The show was also one of the first major American cultural products to engage seriously and recurrently with what we would now call climate change, environmental degradation, the relationship between industrial capitalism and the natural world. Lisa Simpson is Springfield's environmentalist. She is the character who sees the relationship between human activity and environmental consequence most clearly, who advocates most consistently for taking the damage seriously, who makes the arguments that the show knows are correct and ensures they are heard, and then illustrates, episode after episode, how completely those correct arguments fail to produce change in the environment in which they are made. This dynamic, Lisa making the right argument in a room that will not act on it, is the show's most sustained engagement with the environmental question. The show knew that the arguments for taking environmental harm seriously were correct. It did not pretend otherwise. It showed Lisa being correct, and it showed the arguments failing to produce change because the forces aligned against change, the economic dependence on polluting industry, the political capture of regulatory bodies, the short-term logic of systems organized around quarterly returns rather than generational consequences were more powerful than the force of a correct argument made by an 8-year-old vegetarian saxophone player. The show understood something about why environmental action is structurally difficult that took a lot of mainstream environmental communication a long time to acknowledge. The difficulty is not primarily a knowledge problem. People do not fail to address environmental harm because they have not been told it is happening. They fail to address it because the immediate costs of addressing it fall on specific people who are paying attention, while the long-term benefits of addressing it are diffuse and temporally distant and belong to people who do not yet exist. This asymmetry of incentives is the fundamental structural problem of environmental politics, and it is extremely difficult to resolve with more information or more persuasive arguments. The show never pretended it could be resolved. Lisa keeps making the arguments. The arguments keep failing to produce action. Springfield keeps being Springfield. And the river keeps running past the plant that produces Blinky. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007, made the environmental warning explicit in a way that the series had generally managed through accumulation and implication rather than direct statement. The movie's central conflict involves the Environmental Protection Agency determining that Springfield's environmental contamination has reached a threshold at which it constitutes a hazard to the surrounding region, and the solution they implement is to enclose the entire town under a massive glass dome. The dome is played as a plot device, an absurd premise that generates the movie's central dramatic question of how the Simpsons will survive and eventually escape. But the premise deserves to be read more carefully than that. The United States Environmental Protection Agency, operating in the movie's universe as a real federal regulatory body, looks at Springfield and concludes that the town itself is so contaminated, so thoroughly poisoned by its own industrial activity, that the only way to protect the rest of the country from it is physical containment. Springfield is not just a polluted place. Springfield is classified as a contamination event. The people inside it are, functionally, inside a quarantine zone, sealed off from the rest of the country because what is in Springfield is dangerous enough to spread. The movie asks you to read this as premise comedy, but the logic is real and has real-world analogs. There are places in America where the contamination is so extensive and so persistent that remediation is functionally impossible at any reasonable cost, and the operative policy is essentially ongoing containment. Keep the contaminated area contained, monitor the spread, manage the problem rather than solving it. The people inside those areas continue to live there because they have to, because they have nowhere else to go, because their lives and their property and their families are inside the contaminated perimeter, and leaving means losing everything that remaining allows them to maintain. The dome in the Simpsons movie is a physical object. In real contaminated communities, the containment is economic and social. People are inside the boundary because the boundary is drawn around everything they cannot afford to leave behind. The show also had interesting things to say about the relationship between environmental concern and class. Springfield is not a wealthy town. Its residents are working and lower-middle-class people who depend economically on the industry that is harming them. This creates a specific bind that the show depicts with uncomfortable accuracy. The people most harmed by environmental contamination are often the people least able to afford to care about it in the way that organized environmental politics requires. They cannot risk their jobs. They cannot afford the time to attend hearings. They cannot absorb the economic cost of demanding change from the entity that both employs them and poisons them. The environmental movement, for much of its history, has been disproportionately driven by middle and upper-middle-class advocates whose economic security allowed them to prioritize long-term environmental concerns over short-term economic ones. The communities most acutely harmed by environmental contamination have often been left out of that movement partly because of class dynamics and partly because the movement's priorities have sometimes reflected the preferences of its participants rather than the needs of its most affected communities. The Simpsons showed you this tension inside Springfield. The people who have the most reason to demand accountability for what the plant is doing are the people who are most economically dependent on the plant continuing to operate. That dependency is not a coincidence. Burns built it deliberately, and the show made that deliberateness visible across multiple storylines about the plant's role in Springfield's economy. There is a specific episode worth examining closely in this context. It is the one where Homer discovers that the power plant has been dumping nuclear waste into a local waterway and decides to expose it. He prepares to go public. He has the evidence. He has the documentation. He is ready. And then Burns reminds him that Homer's entire financial life, his house, his family's security, his children's food, depends on the paycheck from the plant. And Homer folds. The show plays this as a comedy of cowardice. Homer is afraid of Burns, afraid of losing his job, and so he backs down from doing the right thing. The laughter comes from Homer's specific brand of self-interested rationalization, the way he talks himself out of his own conscience with arguments that are transparently self-serving. It is funny. It is also an accurate description of the silencing mechanism that prevents a lot of environmental accountability. The people who know what is happening are often the people who cannot afford to say so. The workers inside the plant, the employees of the agricultural operation, the people who live in the company housing near the mining facility, they know. They have seen things. They could testify. And the economic cost of testifying, the near certain loss of employment, the legal exposure, the social isolation of being the person who goes outside, is a cost that many people cannot bear. The formal name for the legal protection that should make it safer for people to report environmental violations is whistleblower protection. These protections exist. They are inadequate. The gap between what the law says should protect a whistleblower and what actually happens to a person who reports an environmental violation at their employer is a documented and significant gap. The show depicted this gap as Homer's cowardice. The real dynamic is more structural and less personal than that, but the result is the same. The person who knows stays quiet. The violation continues. Blinky keeps swimming. Season 5 contains an episode that is one of the more pointed pieces of environmental satire the show ever produced. Homer starts a new business, an illegal toxic waste disposal company, after discovering that people will pay him to haul away their waste without asking where it goes. He dumps the waste casually, in rivers, in parks, anywhere convenient. Springfield's environment deteriorates noticeably. The health of residents declines. And Homer is making money, good money, better money than the plant ever paid him, and the show lets that logic run for a while before intervening. The environmental deregulation satire is precise. The episode shows you the economic incentive structure that makes illegal dumping rational from the perspective of an individual actor. Proper disposal is expensive. Improper disposal is cheap. The regulatory enforcement that should close that gap is inadequate. The result is that cutting corners becomes the rational choice for people operating inside the system. Not because they are evil, though Burns is, but because the system is structured in a way that makes harm economically rational. This is the environmental warning that is hardest to hear. It is easier to accept a story about a single bad actor, a Burns-style villain who poisons a town because he is malevolent and greedy, than to accept that environmental harm often emerges from systems where individual actors are each making locally rational decisions that aggregate into collective catastrophe. The villain frame is satisfying. It gives you someone to blame. It suggests that removing or punishing the bad actor will fix the problem. The system frame is harder, because it requires looking at the incentive structures themselves, at the way markets and regulations and enforcement mechanisms are designed, and asking why the incentives keep pointing toward harm. The Simpsons gave you both frames. Burns as the villain, Homer as the individual making locally rational but collectively harmful choices, the plant as the systemic source, the regulatory failure as the structural condition, the economic dependency as the silencing mechanism. The whole architecture of how environmental harm persists in industrial communities was there, every week, in the background of every Springfield shot, in the water running past the plant, in the fish with 3 eyes that nobody thought to follow up on. In the decades since the 3-eyed fish appeared on screen, The global conversation about environmental harm has shifted enormously. Climate change has moved from a scientific concern at the margins of mainstream politics to the central environmental question of the era. The evidence of atmospheric contamination from industrial activity, of ocean acidification, of species loss at rates that biologists describe as the sixth mass extinction, has accumulated to a point where denial requires active effort rather than passive ignorance. The tools for measuring and documenting environmental harm have become more sophisticated. The political movements organized around environmental accountability have grown, and yet the structural problems that The Simpsons was depicting in 1990 remain. The economic dependency that silences affected communities. The regulatory capture that weakens enforcement. The short-term logic of systems organized around quarterly returns. The asymmetry between the immediate costs of change and the diffuse, temporally distant benefits. The concentration of both harm and power in ways that make accountability structurally difficult. Springfield is still there. The plant is still running. The cooling towers are still cracked. The river is still running past the point of discharge. Blinky's descendants are still in the water. And the people of Springfield are still drinking it, because the plant provides the electricity and the jobs and the economic activity that keeps the town alive, and the cost of that dependency is paid slowly, invisibly, in the bodies of the people who live downstream. The show told you this. It told you this across hundreds of episodes and 36 seasons. It showed you the three-eyed fish and showed you the town's response to the three-eyed fish and showed you Burns eating it on television and showed you the investigation going away and showed you Blinky disappearing from the DSEDS. Conversation as if he had never been there. And then it showed you the next episode. And the next. And the next. The river kept running. The plant kept operating. And the warning kept being funny enough that nobody had to take it seriously. Until, of course, you looked at what had been running in your own river. And what had been glowing in your own basement, and whose name was on your paycheck. End of Part 1. Fall asleep to every warning The Simpsons gave you, and you laughed at. Full script, Part 2 of 3, Sections 5 to 8. Section 5. The corporate power warning: one man owns everything. Charles Montgomery Burns was born, according to the show's various flashbacks and references, sometime in the 1880s. He was a child during the Gilded Age. He came of age during the Progressive Era. He has lived through the New Deal, through World War II, through the post-war economic expansion, through the stagflation of the 1970s, through the deregulation era of the 1980s, through the financialization of the 1990s, through the crash of 2008, and he is still here, still running the same plant, still owning the same town, still walking through the same opulent rooms of his mansion, surrounded by the same ancient artifacts of accumulated wealth. Burns is not just a character, he is a historical argument. He is the show's way of making visible the continuity of concentrated power across the American century, the way that wealth at a certain scale tends to compound and self-perpetuate, and insulate itself from the disruptions that reorganize the lives of everyone else. He is the thread that connects the robber barons to the modern billionaire class, the demonstration that concentration of economic power is not a new phenomenon but an old one that has been interrupted only by specific political conditions that are themselves reversible. The show makes this argument through accumulation rather than explicit statement. You learn about Burns piece by piece. A reference here, a flashback there. He attended Yale. He served in World War II in a capacity the show depicts as morally ambiguous at best. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government and kept it. He knew Howard Hughes personally. He has been involved in the political and economic life of Springfield and the surrounding region for over a century, and in all of that time, through all of the upheavals of the American 20th century, his fundamental position has not changed. He is at the top. He has always been at the top. He will continue to be at the top. The show's treatment of why this is, of how it is possible for one entity to maintain this kind of dominance across such a long arc of time, is more sophisticated than the simple villain framing would suggest. Burns is not powerful because he is evil, though he is clearly capable of evil. He is powerful because he built something, or inherited something, that generates power through its own operation. The plant produces electricity. The electricity is essential. The essential service creates the dependency. The dependency creates the leverage. The leverage creates the political influence. The political influence protects the plant from the oversight that might challenge its operation. The loop is closed. The power maintains itself. This is not a cartoon invention. This is a description of how monopoly power actually functions in the real world. The companies that dominate infrastructure, that control access to essential services, that occupy positions in the economy where no meaningful competition exists, do not need to coerce people in the dramatic, personally villainous way that Burns coerces Springfield. They do not need to. The structure itself does the coercing. You pay your electricity bill or you do not have electricity. You use the platform that has your social network or you lose access to your social network. You work for the employer that is hiring or you do not work. The coercion is invisible because it is structural rather than personal. But Burns is personal. The show makes him personal on purpose. It gives the structural force of concentrated capital a face, a voice, a set of specific personal attributes and histories and choices. This is actually a gift because abstraction is the enemy of understanding. It is much easier to think clearly about the dynamics of monopoly power when the monopoly has a face you can describe than when it is a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands whose beneficial ownership traces through a series of shell structures to an entity whose actual human principles have never been publicly identified. Burns's relationship with Smithers is one of the show's most careful explorations of how concentrated power shapes the people closest to it. Smithers is loyal to Burns in a way that exceeds any rational explanation of self-interest. He has devoted his life, subordinated his personal development, suppressed his own desires and identity to the service of a man who views him primarily as a useful function. The show makes clear that Smithers's feelings for Burns go beyond professional loyalty, that there is something in the dynamic that carries genuine emotional weight for Smithers in a way it does not for Burns. But the show also asks, quietly and in the margins, what it means that Smithers has made this choice. What it says about the way power organizes the people around it. The people who serve concentrated power rarely do so out of simple calculation. They do so because the proximity to power provides something they cannot find elsewhere, a sense of importance, a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves, a clarity of purpose that the more diffuse world outside the power structure does not provide. These are human needs. They are exploited by every concentrated power structure that has ever existed, from the royal courts of medieval Europe to the corporate hierarchies of the modern economy. Smithers is the person who is closest to Burns, who knows him best, who has given him the most. And Burns cannot remember Homer's name. The distance between Smithers's experience of their relationship and Burns's is the distance between the person who has invested themselves in serving power and the power that accepts the service without registering the investment. This asymmetry is not a character flaw in Burns exactly. It is the structural reality of what power does to the people who exercise it at scale. When you exist at the center of a system that organizes itself around your preferences and your decisions, the individual human beings who populate that system become functions rather than persons. Homer is the function. Smithers is the more senior function. Whether they are people in any sense that Burns registers is a question the show keeps asking and never quite answering. The show's most pointed critique of corporate power comes through what it does not show as much as through what it shows directly. The things that do not happen in Springfield are as revealing as the things that do. There is no meaningful labor organizing at the plant that succeeds. There are gestures toward it, Homer's brief flirtation with union activity, the occasional moment where workers collectively push back against a Burns decision, but they are always resolved in ways that leave the fundamental power structure intact. Burns wins. He wins because he has more resources, more legal capacity, more political influence, more time than the people opposing him. He wins because the system is designed to make him win. This is not a political argument that the show makes explicitly. It does not editorialize. It just shows you the outcomes. It shows you what happens when workers try to organize against a Burns-scale employer in a town with essentially no other economic options. The outcomes are not good. The workers go back to work. Burns adjusts slightly, enough to make the return feel like a partial victory, and then slowly reasserts the conditions that prompted the conflict in the first place. The show has been depicting this cycle since its earliest seasons. The real-world labor movement in the United States across the same period the show has been running tells a largely parallel story. Union membership as a percentage of the workforce fell consistently from 1,989 to the present. The industries where union organizing was once strongest were transformed by automation, offshoring, and deliberate union avoidance strategies by employers with the resources to pursue them. The political and legal framework around labor organizing shifted in ways that made organizing harder. The economic leverage that workers had once held, the leverage that came from being difficult to replace, was reduced by the availability of cheaper labor elsewhere, and by the automation of functions that had once required human performance. Burns never had to fire workers to make them weaker. He just had to wait. The macroeconomic conditions were moving in his direction. The plant stayed essential. The workers stayed dependent. And the fundamental power relationship never changed. The show also anticipated with uncomfortable precision the specific dynamic of modern platform monopoly that would become one of the defining corporate power debates of the 21st century. The episode in which the townspeople become dependent on a new service or technology that Burns or some Burns-adjacent entity controls, only to find themselves trapped in a dependency they did not fully register entering, is a recurring structural template for The Simpsons. The specific services change. The dynamic does not. This template describes the experience of many people's relationship with the large technology platforms that have come to occupy central roles in daily life. The free services were not free. The cost was paid in data and attention, and the slow erosion of alternatives, the gradual elimination of the other places you might have gone, until the platform was the only option, and the option that was free at the start was extracting value in ways that were not visible at the moment of initial adoption. The show depicted this dynamic in the specific register of Springfield's local economy, but the structure it was depicting was one that would characterize the global digital economy of the 2010s and beyond. Burns's immortality, his ability to remain at the center of Springfield's power structure for over a century, is the show's most explicit statement about the self-perpetuating nature of concentrated wealth. In the real world, the perpetuation of extreme wealth across generations is a documented phenomenon. The proportion of wealth held by the top fraction of the American population has increased over the period the show has been running, reversing the compression of wealth distribution that characterized the post-war decades. The specific mechanisms by which this happens, the tax treatment of inherited wealth, the compounding returns on capital, the access to legal and financial expertise that allows the very wealthy to optimize their positions in ways unavailable to everyone else, have been extensively documented by economists. Burns's mechanism is the weekly radiation treatment that keeps him alive past any normal human lifespan. The real mechanism is more mundane and arguably more effective. You do not need radiation treatments if you have the right lawyers, and the right accountants, and the right political relationships, and the right investment management. You can compound your way to influence that outlasts any individual lifetime, especially if you are organized as an entity rather than a person. If the wealth is held in structures that continue to function after the people who established them are gone, Burns is one man. The entity he represents is not one man. It is the accumulated capital of a century of operations, of political influence, of regulatory capture, of the specific advantage that comes from being the first in your field and using that advantage to prevent others from entering it. He is not just the plant. He is the institutionalization of the plant's power into something that exists independently of any single person's lifespan. The show understands this. The show has always understood this. It depicted it in the form of a very old, very frail, very personally malevolent man who controls an entire town. And it made that depiction so entertaining that watching it every Sunday was one of the pleasures of the American weekend. Burns is still there. He is still in the mansion. He is still signing Homer's checks. He is still unable to remember Homer's name. And the town is still organized around his plant, still dependent on his electricity, still living inside the economic and political landscape that his century of operation has produced. The warning is as old as the show. The warning is as current as this morning's news about whichever billionaire's decisions reorganized which industry or which community this week. And the warning sounds exactly like something you would laugh at on a Sunday night with a beer in your hand, which is why it worked so well, and why it changed so little. Section 6. The Media and Propaganda Warning Springfield's News Problem. Kent Brockman is the most trusted man in Springfield. He is the anchor of the local news. He has good hair, good teeth, and a voice that carries the specific quality of authority that television journalism conferred on its practitioners before the proliferation of media made that authority difficult to sustain. When Kent Brockman tells Springfield what is happening, Springfield believes him. He is the information environment. He is the lens through which the town understands its own situation. Kent Brockman is also, across the entire run of the show, a near-perfect catalog of everything that went wrong with local television journalism in America. Start with the fundamentals. Kent Brockman works for a television station that is owned by someone. The ownership of Channel 6, the station he anchors, is not a major storyline in the show, but it is occasionally made visible. And when it is, the message is consistent. The station operates within a commercial framework that shapes what gets covered and how. The interests of the station's ownership are not always identical to the interests of the audience. The pressures on the editorial process that come from commercial considerations are real and visible. This is not a fictional invention. The history of local television news in America is a history of editorial decision-making shaped by commercial pressures, ownership consolidation, and the specific economic logic of attracting the largest possible audience with the smallest possible production budget. Local television news is expensive to produce well. It requires reporters who know their communities, editors who understand context, time, and resources for investigation. These things cost money. And the commercial logic of local television has, across the period the show has been running, consistently favored the cheaper over the better. Crime stories that require no investigation, weather that fills time reliably, human interest segments that generate emotion without requiring expertise, and conflict framing that makes everything seem more dramatic than it is because drama drives ratings. Kent Brockman embodies all of this with devastating comic precision. His ability to pivot between total sincerity and total cynicism, between apparently genuine concern for the community and obvious self-promotion, between the pose of the responsible journalist and the behavior of someone primarily interested in his own continued visibility, is one of the show's great recurring character performances. He is believable in every register. That is the warning. The person who looks like a responsible journalist is not necessarily oriented toward the same things a responsible journalist should be oriented toward. The medium has aesthetics for trustworthiness. Those aesthetics can be performed by someone who is not actually providing trustworthy information. The episode that most explicitly states the media warning is the one in which Kent Brockman, during a live news broadcast covering a spacecraft mission, receives what appears to be evidence that giant space ants are invading the Earth. Without pausing to verify, without waiting for confirmation, without any of the journalistic practice that should precede the public announcement of something this significant, he welcomes the ant overlords on air. He pivots immediately from journalist to collaborator, from the person whose job is to give the public accurate information about what is happening, to the person who is adapting to the new power structure as quickly as possible. This is played as absurd comedy. The giant ants are not real. The pivot is comically fast, the episode is funny, but the structural behavior being depicted, the willingness to abandon any principled relationship to truth in favor of alignment with whatever force appears dominant in a given moment, is a recognizable media pathology. And the speed of the pivot is the specific detail that makes the comedy cut. Kent Brockman does not hesitate. He does not have to think about it. The calculation is instantaneous. Which way is PowerPointing? Point the microphone that way. The show also spent considerable time on the way Springfield's media ecosystem was shaped by who advertised in it. Businesses that advertised were covered differently than businesses that did not. Stories that threatened the commercial relationships supporting the station were handled differently than stories that reinforced them. The conflict of interest between journalistic independence and commercial survival was built into the structure of the media environment, and the show depicted characters navigating that conflict with varying degrees of awareness and varying degrees of willingness to pretend the conflict did not exist. This is the structural condition of almost all commercially supported journalism. The business model creates an interest in not alienating the advertisers. The interest in not alienating the advertisers creates a systematic tendency to avoid certain kinds of coverage. The avoidance of certain kinds of coverage means there are things in the community's life that the community is systematically not informed about. And the things that are systematically not covered are often the things that matter most, the things where the power structures that generate advertising revenue have interests in not being examined. The consolidation of local media ownership is one of the significant and underreported developments in American public life over the period the show has been running. In 1989, local newspapers and television stations were more often owned by local or regional entities, with some stake in the communities they covered. By the 2020s, the landscape had changed substantially. National chains had acquired hundreds of local television stations. Private equity had acquired local newspapers in large numbers, and had frequently pursued strategies of cost reduction, staff reduction, and coverage reduction that left many communities substantially less informed about their own affairs than they had been before. The consequence of this, of communities that are less well informed about local politics, local environmental issues, local economic conditions, local institutional behavior, is not easily quantifiable but is broadly understood to be significant. When local journalism fails, local corruption finds it easier to persist. Local environmental harm finds it easier to go unaddressed. Local institutional failure finds it easier to continue without accountability. The things that require sustained, expert, community-rooted coverage to remain visible become invisible, and the visibility of these things is the prerequisite for any democratic accountability. Springfield has always had a media problem. Channel 6 and the Springfield Shopper, the local newspaper, are both depicted as unreliable narrators of Springfield's reality. They cover what sells, they miss what matters. They are captured by interests that are not identical to the community's interests. They perform journalism's aesthetics without consistently delivering journalism's substance. And Springfield goes along with it because Springfield has no alternative. Channel 6 is the news. Kent Brockman is the trusted man. If he says the ants are coming, maybe the ants are coming. If he says the nuclear power plant is basically fine, maybe it is basically fine. The information environment shapes the reality that the community is able to perceive and respond to. And in Springfield, as in many real communities, that information environment was being shaped by forces that had interests very different from the community's interests in accurate information. The show also had interesting things to say about celebrity and its relationship to media. The ease with which a celebrity or a compelling personality could command the full attention of Springfield's media environment, while actual substantive issues went underreported, was a recurring observation. This was an observation about the incentive structures of commercial media, rather than a critique of celebrities themselves. Entertainment is cheaper to produce than investigation. Celebrity is more reliably attention-getting than policy. The economic logic of commercial media pushes toward the entertaining and away from the important, and the result is a public that is very well informed about the personalities of famous people and poorly informed about the conditions shaping their own lives. The talk radio and AM radio landscape that Simpsons characters were occasionally exposed to is another dimension of the media warning. The show depicted a version of what we would now recognize as media radicalization, the way certain media environments were designed not to inform but to activate, to generate emotional states of outrage or fear or tribal belonging that would keep audiences returning not because they were being given useful information, but because the emotional stimulation was compelling in its own right. This dynamic, the design of media environments around emotional engagement rather than informational accuracy, would accelerate significantly in the digital era. The algorithmic optimization of social media for engagement, which tends to favor content that generates strong emotional responses over content that is merely accurate or useful, is a more powerful version of the same dynamic that commercial broadcast media had been developing for decades. Springfield's media environment was analog. The principles were the same. The Simpsons also paid attention to the relationship between media spectacle and political reality. The show repeatedly depicted situations in which the media coverage of an event was more influential in determining the event's outcome than the facts of the situation itself. Mayor Quimby's management of a crisis was less about actually addressing the crisis than about managing the optics of the crisis for the media. Burns's response to the Blinky scandal was less about addressing the environmental harm than about performing harmlessness in a media context. The contest between reality and its representation in the media was consistently decided in favor of the representation because the representation was what the people of Springfield actually interacted with. This is a recognizable description of how political reality operates when media is sophisticated and resources for media management are concentrated. The ability to shape representation, to control how events are framed, to flood the zone with counter-narratives, to deploy the aesthetics of responsibility without the substance, is a form of power. It is a form of power that scales with resources. Burns can afford better media management than Homer. The people who can afford better media management than you can shape the information environment in ways that serve their interests rather than yours. The show knew this. It was showing you Kent Brockman pivoting to welcome the ant overlords, and it was letting you laugh at the absurdity of it, and it was hoping, somewhere in the production process, that the laughter would carry with it a residue of recognition, that you would leave the episode slightly more alert to the specific ways in which the information environment you inhabited was being managed in ways you had not fully registered. Whether that hope was justified is the question. Kent Brockman is still on air. He has good hair. He has a trustworthy voice. And when he tells Springfield that everything is fine, Springfield nods and changes the channel to something more entertaining, just like us. Section 7. The Education Warning. Springfield Elementary as a case study. Springfield Elementary School is one of the most precisely realized institutional failures in the history of American television. It is not a school in crisis in the dramatic, made-for-movie sense. It is not a school where children are being actively harmed by teachers who resent them or administrators who have given up. The people who work at Springfield Elementary are mostly well-meaning. They want the children in their care to learn things. They want the institution to function. They are trying, with varying degrees of competence and energy, to do something genuinely difficult. Springfield Elementary is a school in crisis in the quiet way. In the way where the building needs repairs that the budget cannot cover. In the way where the teachers are paid less than they are worth, and the gap between what they are paid and what they could earn elsewhere erodes the applicant pool over time. In the way where the curriculum is not quite adequate to the range of students it is supposed to serve. In the way where the resources do not match the needs, and the mismatch is persistent, and the people inside the institution spend so much of their energy managing the mismatch that there is not much energy left for the actual work of education. This is not a cartoon exaggeration. This is the actual condition of a significant portion of American public schools. The funding mechanisms for public education in the United States, which are largely tied to local property tax bases, create enormous variation in per-pupil spending between wealthy and less wealthy districts. Schools in areas where property values are high have substantially more resources than schools in areas where property values are low. This is not an accident of the system. It is the system. The design of public school funding in most American states systematically produces schools whose resources reflect the wealth of the community around them, rather than the needs of the students inside them. Springfield is not a wealthy town. Its property tax base reflects its working and lower middle-class residential population. The school gets what the town can afford, and what the town can afford has always been less than what the school needs. This is established in the show's first season and remains a background condition throughout the entire run. It is not a plot, it is an environment. Principal Skinner, the man responsible for running Springfield Elementary under these conditions, is one of the show's most carefully drawn portraits of institutional middle management. He is not a bad person. He is a man who cares about his school and his students and is perpetually operating in a space where the constraints on what he can do are so severe that caring about outcomes does not translate into producing them. He is afraid of Superintendent Chalmers above him, managed downward from a position of authority that is itself severely constrained. He is managing teachers who range from competent and dedicated to completely checked out. He is managing a physical plant that is deteriorating faster than the budget can address. Skinner's recurring anxiety, his visible discomfort, his tendency to respond to challenges by retreating into bureaucratic procedure rather than substantive problem-solving, is the portrait of someone who has been in a losing position long enough that the primary goal has shifted from winning to not losing, in ways that could be blamed on him personally. This is not a character flaw. This is what sustained institutional underfunding and inadequate support does to the people inside the institution. It teaches them to manage optics rather than outcomes, because the resources to produce good outcomes do not exist, and the social expectation to perform accountability does. The show's treatment of the teachers at Springfield Elementary deserves specific attention. Mrs. Krabappel, Bart's fourth-grade teacher for most of the show's run, is a character whose arc is one of the more honest depictions of teacher burnout in popular culture. She began her career, we are told, with genuine idealism. She wanted to make a difference. She believed in education. She entered the classroom because she thought it was important work worth doing well. By the time the show introduces her, most of that has been worn away. She is not cruel. She is tired. She is the specific kind of tired that comes from caring about something for years without adequate support, without recognition, without the resources to do the job the way she knows it should be done. She smokes in the classroom. She gives up on getting Bart to engage and settles for getting him to sit quietly. She dates men who are wrong for her in ways that are clearly connected to a more general sense of diminishment. She is a person who is capable of more and has been working in conditions that did not allow her to produce more for long enough that the more capable version of herself has become more memory than present reality. This is teacher burnout. This is what it looks like, what it feels like from the inside, how it shapes the behavior of people who entered a demanding profession with genuine commitment and encountered systems that were not organized to support that commitment. The research on teacher attrition and burnout in the United States describes Mrs. Krabappel with uncomfortable precision. The single largest predictor of teacher departure from the profession is not pay, though pay is significant. It is the experience of feeling unable to do the job well because of conditions outside the teacher's control. It is the gap between what teachers know good teaching requires and what the institution allows them to provide. Mrs. Krabappel stayed. That is also in the data. Many teachers who experience burnout stay because leaving requires having somewhere to go, and because the people who become teachers often have a commitment to the work that persists even after the optimism has gone. They stay and they teach with what they have left, and they carry the gap between what they are capable of and what they are producing as a kind of private grief. The show depicted this. It depicted it in a character who was often played for comedy, whose exhaustion and cynicism were sources of jokes, whose specific relationship with Bart was a comic dynamic built on mutual low expectations. And underneath the comedy was a portrait of institutional failure, so accurate that anyone who had spent time in an underfunded school would recognize it immediately. The funding crisis at Springfield Elementary reaches its most explicit form in a plotline that recurs across multiple seasons. The school loses funding for specific programs: art, music, physical education, the activities that research has consistently shown to be important for whole child development, for student engagement, for the specific kind of creative and physical flourishing that makes school more than a place where children are required to be. These programs get cut. They get cut because there is not enough money. They get cut because when you have to choose between maintaining a building and maintaining a music program, the building is more urgent even if the music program is more important to the students inside it. Lisa Simpson's saxophone is not a random character attribute. It is a precise statement about what is being cut from schools and what the loss of that means to the students who needed it most. Lisa is the child who lives inside her saxophone. Her intellectual and emotional life runs through music in a way that the show makes specific and grounded. Music is not a supplement to her education. It is the part of her education that allows the rest of it to make sense. It is the container for everything she cannot say through speech, the organizing frame for her interior experience. And the school keeps threatening to cut the music program. Every time this happens in the show, it is resolved. The program survives. Lisa keeps playing. But the resolution is always precarious, always provisional, always one budget crisis away from being undone. The music program's survival is not the result of the institution being structured to protect it. It is the result of specific interventions by specific people in specific episodes. The underlying vulnerability remains. Across the United States, between 1989 and the present, arts and music education in public schools has been reduced substantially, and the reduction has been concentrated in lower-income districts. The schools that serve children from wealthy families have maintained robust arts programs, in many cases expanding them, while schools that serve working-class and lower-income children have cut them systematically in response to budget constraints. The children who are most likely to lack arts enrichment outside of school, because their families cannot afford private lessons or community programs, are the children whose school arts programs are most likely to have been cut. Lisa's saxophone is something millions of children did not get to keep. The show also had important things to say about standardized testing, which became an increasingly dominant feature of American public education in the years after The Simpsons began. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 mandated standardized testing across American public schools in ways that significantly changed the experience of being a student and a teacher. The argument for standardized testing is that it creates accountability, that it ensures students are learning what they should be learning, that it gives parents and policymakers objective information about how schools are performing. The argument against it is that it narrows curriculum to the things that can be measured by multiple choice tests, that it creates incentives for schools to teach to the test rather than to learning, that it uses the results to sort and rank schools in ways that concentrate resources in the schools that are already doing well and reduce them in the schools that most need help, and that it does not actually measure many of the things that matter most about education. Springfield Elementary's relationship with standardized testing and its consequences is depicted across several episodes with the kind of specificity that suggests the writers had thought seriously about what testing culture actually does to schools. The episode where Bart has to take a standardized test and the school's ranking, which has real consequences for the school's funding and for Principal Skinner's position, depends on Bart's performance, is both funny and a remarkably precise depiction of the perverse incentives created by high-stakes testing. The school is not asking Bart to learn. It is asking Bart to perform on a specific instrument at a specific moment. The distinction matters. The show understood that the distinction mattered. The Simpsons was also one of the first major popular culture texts to seriously engage with the question of what schools do to children who do not fit the mold they are designed around. Bart is the obvious example. Bart does not perform well in a conventional classroom setting. He is not unintelligent. The show makes clear that Bart has genuine capabilities, real creativity, social intelligence, physical skill, a quality of leadership that emerges in contexts that allow it to emerge. But the conventional classroom does not allow it to emerge. The conventional classroom asks for stillness and compliance and the ability to engage with abstract material through text-based learning, and these are not Bart's strengths. The response that Springfield Elementary's system provides to a child like Bart is essentially punitive. He fails, and the response to his failure is remediation designed to make him more like the student the school is built for, rather than investigation of what kind of learning environment might work for the student he actually is. This is a documented pattern in American education. Boys, in particular boys from lower income backgrounds, who present with the specific combination of traits that Bart has: high energy, preference for physical and social engagement over sedentary textual learning, relative difficulty with the executive function demands of conventional classroom management, are disproportionately failed by the standard educational model and disproportionately likely to be pushed into remedial tracks or disciplinary channels, rather than supported in finding learning environments that suit them. The show does not resolve this. Bart remains in the school. The school remains inadequate to him. The mismatch persists. And because the mismatch persists across 36 years without resolution, it becomes something that The Simpsons is saying, rather than something it is depicting incidentally. The show is saying that the educational system is not designed to serve all of the children inside it, that the mismatch between what the system provides and what certain children need is persistent and structural, and that the children who experience this mismatch bear the cost of it rather than the system that produced it. The education warning in The Simpsons is quiet compared to some of the show's other warnings. It does not have the dramatic high notes of the environmental warning or the corporate power warning. It is delivered in the specific register of institutional life, which is a register characterized by accumulation and constraint, and the slow wearing down of people and programs and possibilities until what remains is less than what was there before. Springfield Elementary is still understaffed. The roof still leaks in at least 2 classrooms. The music program is still 1 budget vote away from being cut. The kids are still there. And some of them are doing fine. The ones the system is built to serve, the Lisas who are so academically capable that the inadequacy of the institution cannot prevent their performance. And some of them are not fine. The Barts who need something the institution cannot provide and are receiving, in lieu of that something, A message about their own failure that the institution delivers without quite intending to? We watched all of this. We watched it every season. We laughed at the scenes where Skinner is publicly humiliated by Superintendent Chalmers, because those scenes are genuinely funny. We did not always notice that what Chalmers was doing to Skinner was what the system was doing to the school, which was what the school was doing to the children, which was what a specific set of policy choices made by people with authority over educational funding had built into the structure from the beginning. The warning was always there. It was always in the background of every episode that took place in that building, with the cracked plaster and the leaking pipes and the tired teachers and the kids who needed more than the building could give them. You just had to look a little past the joke. Section 8. The Family Collapse. Warning what The Simpsons were actually showing us. The Simpsons is, at its core, a show about a family. Everything else, the town, the corporate satire, the media commentary, the environmental critique, exists in service of or in relationship to the family. The Simpsons on the couch, the 5 of them in their specific arrangement, is the show's organizing image. It is the thing everything else radiates from. And the show, with tremendous care and sustained attention over 36 seasons, has been documenting the specific ways in which the forces acting on the modern family from the outside make it extremely difficult for the family to be what families are supposed to be. It has been doing this while appearing to celebrate the family. That is the trick at the heart of the whole thing. The Simpsons looks like a show about a family that endures, and it is. But it is also a show about everything working against that endurance, and the miracle is not that they stay together. The miracle is that they stay together at all, given the conditions the show places them in. Start with time. Homer works at the plant. The plant requires his time. His time at the plant is time away from the family. The family needs him present, and the job requires him absent. And the resolution of this tension is a permanent state of insufficient presence that shapes every family dynamic the show depicts. Homer is home for dinner. Homer is on the couch in the evening. Homer is there for some of the events and absent from others. But the texture of his availability is always tinged by the prior claim of the job. The job is first. The family gets what the job leaves. This is the time poverty of the American working family. It is documented extensively. The number of hours worked by American workers increased over the period the show has been running. The decline of the single-income family, as wages stagnated and the income of both partners became necessary to maintain a middle-class standard of living, meant that the hours of parental attention available to children in a 2-parent household decreased even as the demands of parenting were, by most measures, increasing. Children's activities became more scheduled and more competitive. The expectations on parents to participate in and manage those activities increased. The time available to meet those expectations decreased. Marge carries most of the domestic labor in the Simpson household. This is visible throughout the entire run of the show without ever quite being the explicit subject of an episode. Marge cooks. Marge cleans. Marge manages the children's school involvement, their medical appointments, their social lives, their emotional needs. Marge is the organizational infrastructure of the family. She is the reason Homer can come home and collapse on the couch. She is the reason the children are fed and clothed and aware of what day of the week it is. She is the reason the household functions. And the show is both honest about this and consistently funny about it in ways that tend to normalize the distribution rather than examine it. The research on domestic labor distribution in 2-parent households with a male and female partner consistently shows that women perform substantially more domestic labor than men, even when both partners are employed full-time. This gap has narrowed over the period the show has been running, but it has not closed. The gap has specific costs. It reduces the time and energy women have available for career development, for personal interests, for rest. It is a primary structural factor in the gender income gap. It is experienced by many women as a chronic undervaluation of work they perform for free that would cost significant money to outsource. Marge is performing this work. She has been performing it for 36 seasons. The show occasionally acknowledges what that costs her. It does so in the specific episodes where Marge reaches a breaking point, where the accumulated weight of doing everything becomes visible in a particular moment. But then the episode ends and the next one begins, and Marge is in the kitchen again, and the work is being done, and nobody is quite noticing who is doing it. The family's communication failures are another dimension of the warning. The Simpsons family loves each other. This is not in question. The show has established their love for each other across hundreds of episodes in ways that feel genuinely earned rather than asserted. But their love does not produce effective communication. They consistently fail to tell each other the things that matter most. They misunderstand each other's needs. They make assumptions about what the other family members want or feel or need that turn out to be wrong. And those wrong assumptions produce conflicts that could have been avoided by the specific act of saying the true thing. Homer and Marge have a version of this failure that the show has depicted extensively. Homer does not know how to express his emotional life to Marge. He loves her deeply and shows it in the specific ways his character allows, through occasional grand gestures, through the specific tenderness that breaks through his general emotional flatness at unexpected moments, through the simple, stubborn fact of his presence and his commitment. But he cannot tell her what he is feeling most of the time. He cannot find the words, or finding the words feels too exposed, or the habit of not saying has calcified into an inability. Marge, who is carrying so much of her own interior experience in silence, needs the words. She needs to know that she is seen. She needs the communication that Homer is almost structurally incapable of providing. The show has given them wonderful episodes. Episodes where Homer finds the words and the moment is genuinely beautiful. The Marge and Homer love story is one of the great love stories in the history of television, precisely because the show has taken it seriously, has shown its difficulty honestly, has not allowed it to be simple or easy or problem-free. Their love survives in the show because the writers have made it earn its survival rather than asserting it as given. But the background condition, the relationship running on the fuel of insufficient communication and unequally distributed labor, and the constant time pressure of economic necessity, is the warning. The warning is not that the Simpsons will break apart. The warning is about what it costs them to stay together, about what is being sacrificed and deferred and left unaddressed in the ongoing project of keeping the household intact. The Simpson children's experience of the family is another layer of the warning. Bart's relationship with Homer has been one of the show's most sustained and most complex character relationships. Homer and Bart love each other. This is real in the show, earned through hundreds of episodes of conflict and reconciliation and the specific grace notes of fathers and sons who do not quite understand each other managing to find each other anyway. And the show is also honest about what Bart's childhood has been. Homer's failures as a father are not incidental. They are structural. Homer is not a bad father in the way that bad fathers are bad in movies and television. He is not abusive. He is not absent in the sense of not being there. He is present and loving and trying. But he is cognitively limited, emotionally unavailable in specific ways, often more interested in his own comfort than in the difficult work of understanding what his son actually needs. He reacts. He does not anticipate. He responds to crises rather than preventing them. And his specific relationship with Bart, the strangling, which the show presents as a running gag, is also a depiction of a parent whose primary response to his child's behavior is physical frustration. The gag works because it is absurd enough to be clearly not literal in the domestic violence sense. But it is also clearly showing you a relationship where a child's misbehavior is met with an adult's loss of control, and the pattern of that response is a pattern that shapes children in specific ways. The show understood this. It showed you the consequences. Bart's chronic need for attention. His use of misbehavior as a vehicle for connection with his father in the specific way that children who cannot get positive attention often seek negative attention instead. The specific sadness of episodes where Bart wants something from Homer that Homer does not know how to give. The tenderness that breaks through occasionally. The moments when Homer does see Bart clearly and Bart feels it. The warmth of those moments that is partly so warm because it is so rare. This is the family as a site of simultaneous love and damage. Not the dramatic, clear-cut damage of stories where the family is explicitly broken, but the quieter damage of a family trying very hard to be a family in conditions that make it hard. The economic pressure, the time poverty, the emotional unavailability, the communication failures, the inadequate resources for the children's development. The specific ways in which the adults are themselves damaged by their own histories and by the systems they operate inside, and bring that damage into the family where it shapes the children without quite being visible as damage. The show also had important things to say about the specific dynamic of the family that presents as functional while experiencing internal distress. The Simpsons are, in Springfield's social landscape, a normal family. They are not the most successful family. They are not the worst off. They are in the middle of the distribution, in the place where families are supposed to be, where the American dream is supposed to be happening. And from the inside, from the kitchen table and the living room couch, the distance between the family they appear to be and the family they are is real and persistent and never quite acknowledged. The show has a particular sensitivity to the children in this family, to what children carry when they grow up inside family systems that are doing their best under impossible conditions. Lisa's specific kind of loneliness, the loneliness of the most perceptive person in a family where the perception is more burden than gift. Bart's specific kind of anger, the anger of a boy who is difficult to reach and knows it and acts out because acting out is at least a form of contact. Maggie's specific kind of silence, which in the context of everything the show has told us about Springfield and The Simpsons, is the most interesting character choice of all. What Maggie's silence says, in the context of the family warning, is something about what children absorb when they grow up inside the communication failures and emotional limitations of their family. Maggie watches everything. She misses nothing. She is the most perceptive member of the family, the one who sees the whole picture from a vantage point that nobody else occupies, and she has decided that speaking into what she sees would not produce any outcome worth the effort of speaking. That is not a reading of Maggie that the show makes explicit, but it is a reading that the show's accumulated evidence supports. Maggie has been observing the family for 36 years. She has watched Homer fail to understand what Marge needs. She has watched Marge suppress what she cannot express. She has watched Bart seek and receive inadequate attention. She has watched Lisa speak the truth and have it land without impact. She has understood, through decades of careful observation from behind the pacifier, what the family communication system is capable of producing and what it is not. And she has decided not to add her voice to a conversation that is not yet ready to hear what she would say. The family warning in The Simpsons is also a generational warning. The show has depicted 3 generations of the Simpson family with enough specificity to make the pattern across generations visible. Grandpa Abraham Simpson is a figure of abandonment and regret. He abandoned Homer to a boarding house at some point in Homer's childhood. He failed, by his own accounting, to be the father Homer needed. He is a man living in a retirement home, largely ignored by the family, occasionally visited but not genuinely present in their lives. His stories ramble. His wisdom is buried under the specific confusion of a man who has been separated from relevance and is not sure how to make the connection back. Homer's relationship with his father is the shadow of Homer's relationship with Bart. The patterns passed down are not identical, but they are related. The emotional unavailability, the specific failure of the father-son relationship to provide what both parties need from it, the love that is real but does not quite reach across the distance between what is needed and what is available. Grandpa set patterns. Homer inherited them. Bart is navigating them. The show has been honest about this generational transmission, about the way the failures of one generation become the challenges of the next. The warning here is about the family as a transmission mechanism. The family transmits values, skills, emotional patterns, psychological orientations. It transmits the capacity for relationships and the limitations on that capacity. It transmits the specific ways of handling difficulty that the parents have developed, which are themselves the specific ways their parents handled difficulty adapted to new circumstances. The cycle is not deterministic. People change. Patterns can be interrupted. But the interruption requires awareness, which requires honesty about what is being transmitted, which requires a willingness to look at the family clearly, rather than in the warm, slightly distorted light of affection. The Simpsons looked at its family clearly. It loved them while looking at them clearly, which is the harder thing to do and the more useful thing to depict. It showed you all of it, the love and the limitation, the warmth and the damage, the people trying and the people failing, and the people succeeding in small and specific ways that matter even when the larger pattern has not changed. And it put all of this on television every Sunday night for 36 years and made it funny enough that the warning reached 100 million living rooms where the same patterns were playing out in different keys. The family is still on the couch. The warning is still in the episode. And somewhere in the middle of the laugh, if you let yourself feel it, is the specific ache of recognition. The family you are watching is the family you know. That was always the whole point. End of Part 2. Fall asleep to every warning The Simpsons gave you and you laughed at. Full script, Part 3 of 3. Sections 9 to 12. Section 9. The Political Warning. Springfield government was always broken. Mayor Joseph Quimby has been the mayor of Springfield for the entire run of the show. He has presided over every natural disaster, every civic catastrophe, every economic crisis, every environmental emergency, every dome enclosure, every monorail disaster, every alien encounter, every sideshow Bob near murder, every three-eyed fish news cycle, every instance of Burns shutting down the sun, and every subsequent return to normal that Springfield manages without ever quite addressing what produced the abnormal in the first place. He is still mayor. He is still there. He will probably always be there. Because Mayor Quimby is not a character who can be voted out. He is a character who is the environment. He is not running against a better alternative. He is the only thing that exists in the place where a mayor should be. The show's treatment of Springfield's political system is one of its most pessimistic and most accurate ongoing observations. The pessimism is not cynical in the cheap sense. It does not say that all politicians are corrupt and nothing matters and caring about politics is a waste of time. The pessimism is specific and earned. It names the mechanisms. It shows you how they work. It traces the causal chain from the incentives to the behaviors to the outcomes, and it lets you see that the outcomes, which are bad, are not accidents. They are the predictable results of systems organized around incentives that produce them. Mayor Quimby is the clearest example. His corruption is not hidden, it is performed. He wears it loosely, the way you wear something that has no reason to be concealed, because there is no accountability mechanism that could make concealment necessary. He skims from public funds. He awards contracts to political supporters. He manages crises in terms of their effect on his public image rather than their effect on the people experiencing them. He is influenced by financial contributions in ways that are barely disguised. He gives speeches whose relationship to his private intentions is entirely ornamental, and Springfield keeps electing him. The show does not offer a simple explanation for this. It does not say Springfield elects Quimby because the voters are stupid. It shows you a more interesting set of dynamics. Springfield elects Quimby partly because there is no meaningful alternative, partly because the information environment, see Kent Brockman, does not hold him accountable in ways that would make the corruption legible to a voting public, partly because the economic dependency on Burns makes certain kinds of political challenge too costly to attempt, and partly because the accumulated civic fatigue of a population dealing with constant crises leaves very little energy for the sustained engagement that political accountability requires. This is the democratic accountability deficit, and it is not fictional. The research on political incumbency advantages in the United States has consistently found that incumbent politicians, especially at the state and local level, win re-election at rates that suggest the theoretical possibility of being voted out is less powerful as an accountability mechanism than the design of democratic systems assumes. The combination of name recognition, access to resources, and control over the machinery of government gives incumbents structural advantages that challengers find extremely difficult to overcome. At the local level, where the resources available to challengers are smallest and the information environment is thinnest, these advantages are often decisive. Local elections in many American communities have extremely low turnout. Low turnout elections can be dominated by organized interests, by people who are reliably motivated to vote because they have specific stakes in the outcome, in ways that the broader population, which has diffuse general interests in good governance, cannot match. The result is local government that is more responsive to organized interests than to the general population, which is precisely what Springfield's government depicts. The show also paid sustained attention to the relationship between political power and law enforcement. Chief Clancy Wiggum of the Springfield Police Department is, in some ways, the most consequential character in the show's political landscape. He is the person responsible for enforcing the laws in Springfield. He is the person who investigates crimes, makes arrests, maintains public order. He is, in theory, the institutional expression of the community's decision about what behaviors are acceptable and what consequences should follow from unacceptable behaviors. In practice, Wiggum is incompetent in ways that range from comic to chilling depending on the context. He is slow, he is easily distracted, he has priorities that do not always align with the public interest. He is susceptible to influence from people with power. He solves crimes by accident rather than by investigation. He arrests the wrong people. He misses things that are obvious. He looks the other way when looking the other way is convenient. He is, in short, a profoundly inadequate public safety institution in human form. The show loves Wiggum in the specific way it loves all its characters, with genuine affection and without contempt. His incompetence is humanized. His failures are made funny. He has a family and moments of genuine feeling and specific charms that make him likable, even as you recognize that his job performance is catastrophic. This is important. The show does not make Wiggum a villain. It makes him a person who is not right for his job in ways that have serious consequences for the community that depends on him doing that job. The pattern of law enforcement that The Simpsons depicts, where the protection offered by the police is inconsistent and often aligned with the interests of the powerful rather than the vulnerable, where accountability mechanisms are weak and are further weakened by the personal relationships between police leadership and political leadership, where the use of police resources reflects social hierarchies rather than community needs, was a pattern that American communities were beginning to examine more closely in the years the show was running. The conversation about policing, accountability, the relationship between law enforcement and the communities it serves has been one of the most significant political conversations in America over the past decade. The Simpsons had been laying the groundwork for that conversation for 30 years. The show's treatment of the legal system is equally pointed. Springfield's courts are populated by characters whose relationship to justice is tenuous at best. Judges who are influenced by personal relationships. Lawyers who are more concerned with theatrics than with truth. A legal process that the people with resources and connections navigate very differently from the way the people without resources and connections navigate it. Burns's ability to walk away from situations that would have destroyed anyone without his access to legal expertise and political relationships is a recurring demonstration of the differential application of law in a society organized around economic inequality. The show also engaged with something that the formal study of democratic institutions calls the problem of collective action. Springfield is repeatedly depicted in situations where the residents, if they acted together, could produce outcomes substantially better than what they get under the status quo. They could demand accountability from Quimby. They could organize around the plant's safety violations. They could challenge the information environment that keeps them misinformed. They have the numbers. They have the latent power of a voting majority. They have the information, or at least access to the information, that would justify using that power. They do not use it, not sustainably. There are moments of collective action in Springfield, moments when the town mobilizes around a specific issue, but these moments tend to be reactive rather than sustained, emotional rather than strategic, and they tend not to produce lasting institutional change. The town acts, the immediate trigger resolves, and the underlying conditions return. This is the collective action problem. Sustained, organized, strategic civic engagement is difficult to maintain, particularly in communities dealing with the kinds of economic stress and institutional distrust that Springfield displays across its entire run. The political warning in The Simpsons crystallizes most sharply in the episodes that deal with civic decisions, with the moments when Springfield as a whole has to decide something that will affect everyone inside it. The monorail, the dome. The various crises that require collective response, the show depicts over and over again the specific vulnerabilities of democratic decision-making when the information environment is inadequate, when the organized interests have more influence than the general public, when the short-term emotional logic of the moment overwhelms the longer-term strategic thinking that good decisions require. Springfield is bad at making decisions as a community. It is susceptible to manipulation by anyone who understands how to work the specific levers of Springfield's political psychology. It is susceptible to the charismatic argument, to the compelling story, to the emotional appeal that overrides the boring but necessary work of examining evidence and considering consequences. It is susceptible to fear and to flattery, and to the specific seduction of being told that the easy answer is the right answer. This susceptibility is not a Springfield invention. It is a documented feature of democratic decision-making in conditions of high complexity, high stress, and inadequate information. The research on political psychology has spent decades examining the conditions under which people make political decisions that do not serve their interests. The cognitive shortcuts and emotional dynamics and social pressures that shape political behavior in ways that deviate from the rational actor model. Springfield's voters are exhibiting these documented human tendencies in every episode that involves a civic decision. And we watched and we laughed at the monorail and we laughed at the people who bought the pitch. And we did not ask ourselves what we had bought recently? What compelling argument had led us somewhere that careful examination of evidence might not have taken us? What our own version of the monorail was. Which was, of course, exactly the question we should have been asking. The political warning is long. It has been running for 36 years. It has depicted more elections, more civic meetings, more governmental failures, more moments of collective vulnerability to manipulation than any other show in the history of television. And the thing it has been saying, consistently, through Quimby and Wiggum and the various episodes of civic decision-making that go wrong in specific and recognizable ways, is that democracy is not automatic. It requires an informed public and accountable institutions and a genuine commitment to the difficult work of self-governance, and those things do not happen by themselves. They require maintenance. They require attention. They require the willingness to hold the Quimbys of the world accountable even when accountability is inconvenient and even when the alternative to Quimby is unclear. Springfield has never done this work. Springfield has always been too busy with the immediate crisis to address the structural conditions that produce the crises. Springfield's political system has been performing the function of legitimate governance while failing to provide it, and Springfield has been accepting the performance because the performance is all there is. That is the warning. And the warning was always there. In every episode where Quimby waved from the podium, in every scene where Wiggum arrived too late at the wrong address, in every moment where the town mobilized for something immediate and forgot the underlying thing it was supposed to be mobilizing against, the performance of democracy, instead of the thing itself. Section 10, the technology warning. Springfield saw the digital age coming. In a 1995 episode of The Simpsons, a character is shown using a device on their wrist that allows them to communicate remotely and access information in real time. This was 3 years before the first smartphone prototypes existed in any form that resembled what we would come to use. It was 11 years before the iPhone. The show was not imagining science fiction. It was extrapolating a visible trajectory. In the same episode, there is a depiction of what we would now recognize as autocorrect, the tendency of predictive text systems to replace what you type with something adjacent, but wrong in ways that change the meaning entirely. The gag is about Bart trying to write something and the device substituting a different word for the one he intended. In 1995, this was pure comedy. By 2010, it was everyone's daily experience. The show also famously depicted Homer accessing what is recognizable as an early version of the internet in multiple early to mid-90s episodes. The specific episodes where Homer goes online and is immediately overwhelmed by the combination of information and distraction and the specific quality of social interaction in an online environment are among the most quoted Simpsons moments of the era. They are funny. They are also a precise depiction of the internet experience that the majority of Americans would not have until years later. But the technology warning in The Simpsons is deeper than the specific predictions, which we addressed in the other video's discussion of the predictions phenomenon. The deeper warning is about the relationship between technology and human behavior, about what happens when powerful new tools are introduced into societies that are not quite prepared for them, about the way technology amplifies existing tendencies rather than creating new ones, so that the problems that existed before the technology become, with the technology, more intense and more visible and more consequential. The show's depictions of television deserve specific attention in this context, because television is the technology that The Simpsons understands most intimately. Homer watches a lot of television. The television watching is one of his defining character attributes, one of the things most associated with who he is. He watches what he wants, when he wants, for as long as he wants. The television is his primary source of entertainment, his primary source of information, his primary source of connection to a world beyond Springfield. And his relationship to it is one of sustained, uncritical consumption. The show has always understood what it was doing by making television watching central to Homer's character. It was a show on television, watched by people watching television, depicting a character whose relationship to television was a comic exaggeration of the relationship of the audience to the medium they were currently consuming. The self-referential quality of this was sometimes made explicit, but it was always present. The show was showing you what television watching looked like from a slight distance, showing you the behavior of passive consumption in a character whose intelligence and social engagement were both significantly reduced by the habit of it, and letting you recognize yourself in the portrait. This recognition was the technology warning about television. The show understood that television was not a neutral technology, that the specific qualities of television as a medium, the passivity it encouraged, the replacement of social and creative engagement with consumption, the way it organized time around its own schedule rather than the viewer's needs, the specific sedation of sitting and watching rather than doing or talking, or being present in the world in other ways, had effects, that those effects accumulated over years of viewing, that a man who spent his evenings in front of the television was spending time there rather than somewhere else, was receiving something from the television rather than from the direct experience of the world was, in some specific and quantifiable way, different for the watching. The research on the effects of heavy television viewing on health, cognitive function, social engagement, and a range of other outcomes has been extensive and consistent. The hours spent watching television are hours not spent in other activities. They are not neutral. The sedentary character of television watching has physical consequences. The passive consumption character has cognitive consequences. The substitution of television for social engagement has social consequences. Homer is, in this reading, not just a funny fat man who loves TV. He is a detailed portrait of what the research describes, of a person whose life has been shaped by the dominant media technology of his era, in ways that have costs he does not register. The internet and social media, which emerged over the later years of the show's run, repeated and amplified every element of the television dynamic that the show had been depicting since 1989. The passivity, the consumption orientation, the substitution for direct social engagement. The specific quality of information exposure that the technology provided, which was more stimulating and more reinforcing than informative or challenging. The way the technology organized time around its own demands. The addictive loop of engagement metrics and algorithmic optimization that social media platforms developed was, in functional terms, an intensification of every dynamic that Homer's television watching had been illustrating since the beginning of the show. The show began adapting its references to the internet as internet culture became mainstream. Springfield got online. Characters started using devices. The jokes about technology updated to reflect the current state of the technology. And underneath the jokes, the same observation persisted. The new technology was doing to people what the old technology had done, faster and more efficiently, and with greater integration into every aspect of daily life. The technology warning about television was also a technology warning about whatever comes after television. The Simpsons was a show that understood, from the inside, how the medium it existed in shaped its audience. It used that understanding to depict what living inside a media technology did to people. And the portrait it drew of Homer, consuming passively, disengaging from the world that the television made it easier not to engage with, was a portrait that would become more rather than less recognizable as the decades passed and the technology evolved and the consumption became more and more total. The show also spent considerable time on the technology of the nuclear plant, which is a specific kind of technology warning about what happens when complex, dangerous systems are operated by people who do not understand them. Homer's relationship to the technology he is nominally responsible for overseeing is the show's most sustained engagement with the human dimension of technological risk. He does not understand the technology. He operates it through habit and through the minimal familiarity that comes from being in proximity to something for a long time without actually engaging with it. He is not equipped to identify what is going wrong or to respond appropriately when something does. The 2011 Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, which was triggered by a combination of design vulnerabilities and a failure of emergency response protocols, involved human decision-making under conditions of incomplete information and inadequate preparation. The subsequent investigation revealed patterns that the show had been depicting for years. The gap between the nominal competence of a facility's safety function and the actual competence required to handle unexpected scenarios, the tendency to underestimate risk because the risk had not yet materialized, the organizational pressures that make raising safety concerns difficult even when the concerns are legitimate. Homer raising a safety concern at the plant and being ignored? Or Homer having a safety concern and not raising it because it seems like too much trouble? Or Homer identifying a problem and resolving it through a method that is accidentally effective but deeply wrong? Are recurring comic templates of the show. They are funny because they are absurd. They are also a sustained observation about the human factors in industrial safety, about the gap between what safety protocols assume about the people implementing them and what the people implementing them actually are. The technology warning in The Simpsons is ultimately about the relationship between human limitation and technological power. Technology is a force multiplier. It amplifies the capabilities of the people using it, but it also amplifies their errors and their limitations. When the technology is powerful and the humans operating it are inadequately equipped, the results can be catastrophic. And the mismatch between technological capability and human preparedness is a feature of many of the most significant technological risks of the past century. It is a feature of nuclear energy. It is a feature of industrial chemistry. It is a feature of algorithmic systems whose behavior is not fully understood by the people deploying them. It is a feature of social media platforms whose psychological effects on their users were not modeled before they were launched. Homer's hand hovering over the button at the plant is a specific image for a general situation. The button is real and the consequences are real, but the person in the chair is Homer. This is the technology warning. The technology has arrived. The humans have not quite caught up, and the gap between the two is where the accidents live. Springfield saw the digital age coming because Springfield was always a show about the relationship between human beings and the forces that shape their lives, and technology is one of those forces. It saw the way television was shaping its audience because it was made by people who were shaped by television. It saw the way digital technology would amplify existing tendencies because the existing tendencies were already visible in the analog world. It put Homer in the chair at the plant and showed you what insufficient human capacity relative to technological consequence looked like, and it let you laugh at it. The laugh is still available. The warning is still accurate. The technology has only gotten more powerful, and the Homers in the chairs have not fundamentally changed. Section 11. The community and loneliness warning a town full of isolated people. Moe's Tavern is Springfield's communal space. It is where the men of Springfield gather. It is where Homer finds the companionship that is his primary social experience outside of his family. It is where Barney lives. It is where Lenny and Carl and the other plant workers end up after their shifts. It is where news spreads, where stories are told, where the social glue of Springfield's working-class male community gets applied and reapplied in the specific way that regular proximity to familiar people in a familiar place provides. And Moe's Tavern is the loneliest place in Springfield. This is not a contradiction. It is a precise description of a specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of people who are together because they do not know how to be together in any more meaningful way. The loneliness of men who are in the same room and are not talking, not really, not about the things that would require the kind of vulnerability that nobody in the room is equipped to offer or receive. The loneliness of community that is organized around shared consumption rather than genuine connection. They are all drinking the same beer in the same bar, and none of them are quite reaching each other. Moe is the loneliest of all. He is the person whose job is to be present for everyone else's companionship. He listens, he pours, he is reliably there, reliably available, reliably attentive to the specific needs of the people who constitute his entire social world. And nobody is quite reliably there for Moe. He is the bartender, which means he is adjacent to community without quite being inside it. He is the one who closes up at the end of the night and goes home alone. He is the one whose longing for genuine connection runs as a persistent undercurrent through everything the show gives him, surfacing in his periodic romantic failures, in his sudden enthusiasms for things that might give his life meaning, in the specific despair that the show occasionally allows to become visible before covering it with a joke and moving on. The show has always known that Mo is the saddest person in Springfield. It has always known this, and it has always, carefully, surrounded the sadness with enough comedy that you could see it without having to sit with it. The comedy is not a betrayal of the sadness. It is the show's way of showing you something true without making you feel that watching television was a mistake. You can hold both things at once. Mo is funny. Mo is also the most vivid portrait of adult male loneliness in the history of the sitcom. These things coexist. The loneliness warning in The Simpsons is broader than Mo. It is the story of an entire community that is adjacent to itself rather than connected to itself. Springfield has a high population density, which is to say that the people of Springfield are in close physical proximity to each other. They see each other at the Quickie Mart. They sit next to each other at community meetings. They share the same streets and the same school and the same bar and the same television station. They are, in the geographic sense, a community. What they lack is the sustained, reciprocal, emotionally meaningful connection that research identifies as the defining feature of genuine social health. They lack the friendships that require vulnerability. They lack the community institutions that create context for genuine relationship. They lack the time, partly because time poverty is real, and the economic conditions of Springfield life do not leave a lot of surplus available for the slow work of building deep connections. But they also lack the habits. They lack the practice. They lack the cultural scripts for the kind of relationship that moves beyond the comfortable surface of shared presence into the more challenging territory of genuine knowing. The research on social connection and loneliness in the United States tracks a consistent deterioration over the period the show has been running. The number of close friends that Americans report having declined significantly. The percentage of Americans who report having no one to confide in increased. The hours of social activity, the time spent in the company of other people in contexts of genuine social engagement, fell. These trends were identified and tracked across multiple large longitudinal studies, and they were consistent across demographic groups. The causes are multiple and interrelated. The time poverty that the show's economic warning describes is one of them. People who are working more hours have less time for the slow, unproductive, unscheduled time. That is often the context in which genuine friendships develop. The geographic mobility that the American economy increasingly required, as job opportunities concentrated in specific cities and regions, separated people from the communities and social networks they had grown up inside. The decline of the civic institutions, the churches, the community organizations, the fraternal orders, the local clubs that had historically provided context for social connection, reduced the infrastructure through which people had formed relationships with others outside their immediate family and workplace. The Simpsons showed you all of these forces working on a community. It showed you Springfield's civic institutions as mostly inadequate or captured. It showed you the economic pressure that consumed time and energy. It showed you the geographic stability that came from economic constraint. Nobody in Springfield can afford to leave, which could have been a source of community but was not, because stability and proximity is not the same as connection. The Simpson family itself is the show's most intimate portrait of the loneliness dynamic. Homer and Marge love each other. They have been together for decades. They are, in the formal sense, each other's primary relationship. And yet the show depicts, with consistent honesty, the specific loneliness of people in long-term relationships who have stopped quite reaching each other. The habitual nature of their connection, the way familiarity creates a kind of comfortable opacity, where you know the person so well in certain ways that you stop looking, stop being curious, stop doing the work that genuine intimacy requires. This is one of the most common experiences in long-term relationships and one of the least depicted in popular culture, which tends to prefer the dramatic arc of love newly formed or love under dramatic external threat. The Simpsons showed you what the middle of a marriage looks like. The comfortable dinner table where nobody is quite saying what they are feeling. The bed where two people who love each other are lying in the dark not talking. The kitchen where Marge is managing the logistics of the family and Homer is present but not engaged. The show showed you this without making it melodrama, without turning it into a crisis that could be resolved, because it understood that this quality of relationship is not a crisis, it is a condition. It is what happens to love over time in the specific conditions of the American family life the show was depicting. The loneliness warning intersects with every other warning the show raises. The economic warning produces time poverty that reduces social connection. The mental health warning produces emotional unavailability that limits the depth of connection. The media warning produces the substitution of passive consumption for active social engagement. The political warning produces civic disengagement that eliminates the context for civic friendship. The education warning produces communities that lack the shared experiences and common references that create social cohesion. All of the warnings feed into and reinforce the loneliness. They are all aspects of the same system. The show also understood that certain kinds of loneliness are specifically gendered in ways that create specific problems. Male loneliness, the kind that Homer and Moe and Barney and the men of Springfield experience, is often invisible because the cultural scripts around masculinity do not provide language for it. Men are not supposed to need connection in the ways that loneliness reflects a need for connection. Men are supposed to be self-sufficient. They are supposed to manage their interior lives privately. The bar is not an expression of a need for belonging. It is just where you go. The beer is not self-medication for a longing that has no other outlet. It is just a beer. This invisibility of male loneliness is itself a significant social problem. The health consequences of chronic social isolation are substantial. Loneliness is associated with increased risk of a range of physical and mental health problems, with decreased immune function, with shorter lifespan. The specific vulnerability of men to the health consequences of social isolation is documented in multiple longitudinal studies, and the cultural scripts that prevent men from acknowledging the loneliness or seeking the connection that would address it contribute to the persistence of the problem. The Simpsons has been depicting this for 36 years. It has been showing you Homer's loneliness under the surface of Homer's social life. It has been showing you Moe's structural isolation behind his role as the social facilitator of others' togetherness. It has been showing you Barney's loneliness manifest as alcoholism, and the way the alcoholism and the loneliness reinforce each other in a loop that the bar perpetuates. And it has been making all of this funny, making you love these characters, making you genuinely fond of the specific people who are depicting this dynamic, because the comedy is the delivery mechanism. The warning about loneliness is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the background hum of Marge in the kitchen in the late evening after the children are asleep and Homer has fallen asleep in front of the television. It is the specific silence between two people who are together and are still alone. It is the Moe at the end of the night, the lights off, the bottles wiped, the door locked, going home to whatever Moe goes home to. We laughed at the bar. We loved the regulars. We recognize the specific warmth of people who show up for each other in the only way they know how to show up, which is through presence rather than through the deeper forms of connection that presence is supposed to enable. And then we went home to our own version of the bar. Our own comfortable company without genuine connection. Our own long-term relationships running on familiarity rather than curiosity. Our own evenings in front of screens that were so much easier than the slow, demanding work of being actually present with the people in the same room. The town was full of isolated people. And so, watching that town were we. Springfield was always the mirror. That was always the point. Section 12. Conclusion: the show told us everything. There is a moment late in the run of The Simpsons, in one of the later seasons, where Homer is sitting on the couch alone. It is late. The house is quiet. Everyone else is asleep. The television is off, which is unusual. Homer is just sitting, not doing anything, not watching anything, just sitting in the living room of the house he has lived in for 3 decades, surrounded by the objects and the memories and the specific atmosphere of a life that has been lived there. The show does not do much with this moment. It is transitional. It passes. The next scene begins and the plot continues. But the moment itself, Homer sitting alone in the quiet of a family home after everyone has gone to sleep, is one of the most quietly resonant images in the entire run of the show. Because Homer in that moment is not a cartoon. He is a person at the end of a long day in the middle of a long life. He is tired. He probably does not know exactly what he is feeling. He is sitting with the specific weight of a man whose life is full and also somehow insufficient, whose family is present and somehow not quite reachable, whose days are busy and whose interior life remains, despite all the years and all the episodes, essentially unexamined. And the house around him is the house that the warnings were about. We have spent this entire video walking through the things The Simpsons was saying. The economic precarity dressed as Homer's sitcom existence. The mental health struggles dressed as character comedy. The environmental contamination dressed as the background detail of every Springfield exterior shot. The concentrated corporate power dressed as the villain we love to watch be villainous. The media failure dressed as Kent Brockman's perfect hair. The educational inadequacy dressed as Springfield Elementary's specific flavor of institutional dysfunction. The family under pressure dressed as the show's warm center. The political system failing dressed as Mayor Quimby's endless incumbency. The technology reshaping human life dressed as Homer's TV habits. The loneliness dressed as Moe's Tavern. Every section of this video has been a different angle on the same underlying reality. The Simpsons was one of the most sophisticated and sustained social critiques in the history of popular culture. It used comedy the way the best comedy has always used it, not as a way of escaping uncomfortable truths, but as a way of making uncomfortable truths bearable enough to look at directly. It made Springfield funny so that you would keep watching. It made you love the characters so that you would stay in the room. It made the jokes land so that you would lower your guard. And then, while your guard was down, it showed you everything that was wrong. The show was always operating on two levels simultaneously. The surface level, where the episodes were about whatever they were ostensibly about, the monorail, the fish, the shooting, the coma, the principal who was not the principal, was the level that generated the laughter and the loyalty and the cultural penetration. But underneath the surface, running through everything, was the other level. The level where the show was a documentary, where Springfield was not a funny made-up town but a precise model of a real one, where the characters were not lovable comedic exaggerations but clinical portraits of people navigating systems designed to produce the specific outcomes they were experiencing. You could watch the show for 36 seasons and experience only the surface level. Millions of people did. It was entirely satisfying. The jokes were good enough, the characters lovable enough, the storytelling compelling enough that you could have a full and rich experience of the show without ever quite engaging with what the show was also doing. This was by design. The surface level had to be genuinely great for the deeper level to work. If the comedy was poor, people would not watch, and if they did not watch, the thing underneath the comedy would reach no one. The tragedy is that the thing underneath the comedy reached hundreds of millions of people and produced relatively little change in the conditions the show was depicting. This is not a criticism of the show. Art is not policy. Comedy does not have a legislative mechanism. The Simpsons was not responsible for fixing the things it was identifying. The responsibility for that was distributed among the citizens and the institutions and the political processes that the show was also carefully showing you the failures of. But the failure to act on the warnings is worth naming. The economic warnings were clear, and they were early, and the economic trajectory of the past 36 years has gone in exactly the direction the show described. The wealth concentration has increased. The middle-class stability has eroded. The precarity that Homer's life depicted has become more, rather than less common. The Burnses have gotten richer. The Homers have stayed at the plant. The mental health warnings were clear, and they were early, and the mental health crisis that was already visible in 1989 has deepened substantially. The rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and a range of related conditions have increased. The infrastructure for addressing mental health needs has remained inadequate. The cultural scripts that prevent people from seeking help have changed somewhat, but the structural barriers to access have not changed enough. Marge is still humming. Homer is still sitting in the quiet of a late evening, not knowing what he feels. The environmental warnings were extraordinarily clear and extraordinarily early, and the environmental trajectory of the past 36 years has been one of the most consequential stories in human history. The atmospheric carbon concentration has increased significantly. The documented effects of climate change have become visible across the globe. The communities most affected are disproportionately the communities that look like Springfield, economically dependent on the industries causing the harm, politically insufficiently powerful to compel accountability. Blinky's descendants are still in the river. The corporate power warnings were precise and sustained, and the concentration of economic power in the hands of fewer and fewer entities has accelerated dramatically over the period the show has been running. The 10 largest companies in the United States in 2024 are worth more, in aggregate, than the total GDP of most countries. The ability of any democratic process to meaningfully constrain the decisions of entities at this scale is genuinely unclear. Burns is bigger than ever. The media warnings were accurate and early, and the information environment has deteriorated in ways that make the Kent Brockman era look like a golden age of journalistic integrity. The collapse of local news, the rise of algorithmically optimized attention capture, the fragmentation of the shared information environment that democratic deliberation depends on, have all proceeded faster and further than the most pessimistic projections of the early 1990s. The ant overlords are arriving, and Kent is already figuring out what to say to them. The education warnings have tracked a documented and continuing decline in the proportion of American children receiving adequately resourced public education. The gap between well-funded and poorly funded schools has widened. The arts and music programs that Lisa's saxophone represented have been cut at rates and in patterns that track precisely with what the show depicted. Mrs. Krabappel is tired in classrooms across the country. The family warnings have played out across 3 decades of data showing increasing rates of parental burnout, declining child well-being on multiple indicators, documented increases in childhood anxiety and depression, and persistent structural conditions that make the work of being a family in America harder rather than easier. The family is still on the couch. The warning is still in the episode. The political warnings have been so thoroughly borne out that the gap between Springfield's fictional Democratic failures and the documentary record of Democratic dysfunction in the United States in the 2020s has narrowed to the point where the distinctions are subtle. The Quimbys are real. The Wiggums are real. The collective action failures are real. The susceptibility to the monorail pitch, to the charismatic argument that makes the comfortable answer feel like the wise one, is documented and demonstrable. The technology warnings have been validated by the experience of living through the smartphone era and the social media era and the algorithmic optimization era and the artificial intelligence era. Homer's hand on the button in the plant has been joined by 1,000 other hands on 1,000 other buttons, and the gap between the power of the systems being operated and the human capacity to understand and control them has not closed. The loneliness warnings have been confirmed by research that has become so consistent and so alarming that the Surgeon General of the United States issued an advisory in 2023 describing loneliness as a public. The data on social isolation and its consequences for health and well-being have become one of the significant findings of public health research of the past 20 years. Mo is wiping down the bar at closing time in communities across the country. The warnings were right. The show was right. The thing it was describing was real, and it was happening, and it has continued to happen, and in most cases has gotten worse, in the specific ways the show was warning it would. And we loved it. We loved every episode. We quoted every line. We laughed at every joke. We watched Homer fall, and we watched Burns scheme, and we watched Lisa argue, and we watched Springfield forget, and we watched the dome go up and the dome come down and the fish with 3 eyes disappear from the conversation, and we called it one of the greatest shows ever made, which it is. And then we went to work on Monday, and we lived inside the thing the show had been showing us. This is not an accusation. The people who watched The Simpsons and kept going to work and kept living their lives were not failing some responsibility they had to the show's critique. The show itself understood this. The show knew that its viewers were, in most cases, Homer and Marge rather than Burns. The show knew that the people watching did not have the power to change the structural conditions that the show was depicting. Homer cannot fix the nuclear plant. Marge cannot restructure the domestic labor economy. Lisa cannot reform the school board from inside Mrs. Krabappel's classroom. The show was not assigning blame to its audience. The show was doing something subtler and in some ways more important. It was naming things. It was creating a language for the experience of living inside systems that were not serving you, of feeling the weight of the conditions without quite being able to articulate what the conditions were or why they felt the way they felt. Springfield gave people a reference point. When you felt the specific anxiety of a paycheck that was technically enough but emotionally insufficient, you had Homer's bank account as a way to think about it. When you felt the specific exhaustion of doing the household's invisible work without recognition, you had Marge's kitchen as a frame. When you felt the specific frustration of being right and being dismissed, you had Lisa's saxophone as an emblem. The language is not nothing. The language is actually quite a lot. The ability to name your experience, To recognize it in a form that has been given to you by someone else who saw it clearly and depicted it honestly is one of the things that makes human beings capable of connecting with each other across the distances that separate them. You could not explain to your neighbor how you were feeling about your financial situation, but you could both reference Homer and be understood. The shorthand was a form of community. The show was a form of community. It was a shared language for shared experiences that had not quite found another way to be spoken. This is not a small thing. This is part of what endures about The Simpsons, beyond the comedy and the craft and the longevity. It gave people words for things they were living through. It made the invisible visible. It made the structural feel human. It took the vast, abstract forces shaping millions of lives and put them in a house on Evergreen Terrace, and gave them names and faces and backstories and let you feel what it was like to be inside them rather than just abstractly aware that they existed. That is what art is supposed to do. That is what the best art does. It does not fix the problem. It makes the problem real in a way that abstraction cannot. It creates the emotional and cognitive conditions for the engagement with the problem that might, eventually, produce the change that the art itself cannot produce. It is the first step, not the whole journey. But without the first step, the journey cannot begin. The Simpsons took that first step tens of thousands of times across 36 seasons. It named the thing. It showed you the thing. It made the thing funny enough to watch, and true enough to feel, and human enough to love. And then it trusted you with the next step. The question of whether we took it is one that belongs to the world outside Springfield. The world that the show was always about. The world that the show was always showing us through the specific and strange and somehow familiar streets of a town that exists everywhere and nowhere, that belongs to everyone who has ever felt the particular weight of the particular combination of things that make being alive in modern America what it is. Homer is still at the plant. He has been there since 1989. He will probably always be there. The plant will always need a safety inspector, and Homer will always be the man in the chair, hand near the button, eating a donut, doing his best with what he has, which is never quite enough and always, somehow, enough. The warnings are still there. They are in every episode. They have always been in every episode. They are in the water and the air and the faces of the people who live in the contamination zone that is Springfield, and that is also everywhere. You laughed at them. So did we. So did everyone. And the warnings kept being right anyway. The show knew that would happen too. It kept making the warnings funnier and funnier, season after season, episode after episode, because it understood that the only thing that would keep you in the room long enough to hear them was the laughter. And it needed you in the room, not to act on the warnings, necessarily, though that would be something, just to hear them, just to let them sit somewhere in you, where they might do what warnings sometimes do when they have lived inside a person long enough. They become the thing you already knew, the thing you cannot unknow. The thing that, when someone puts it plainly, when someone says it without the comedy around it, you recognize immediately, because the show put it inside you decades ago and it has been there ever since, waiting for a moment when it might mean something. This video is that moment, or it is trying to be. The Simpsons gave you the warning. In every episode you ever watched, in every joke, that was also something more than a joke. In every character who was also a portrait. In every Springfield catastrophe that reset by the next week but was also a document. The show gave you everything you needed to understand the world you were living in, and it gave it to you in the most entertaining possible form, and it trusted you to do something with it. The house on Evergreen Terrace is still there. The family is still on the couch. The plant is still running behind them. Beyond the window, cracked cooling towers bleeding into the sky. The fish with 3 eyes is still in the river. The mayor is still waving from the podium. The bartender is still alone at closing time. The girl is still playing her saxophone into the night, the music going somewhere, carrying something, trying to say the thing that words alone cannot reach. And somewhere in Springfield, in the hospital, in the dream, Homer is still finding his way home, because in his dream he never left, because in his dream the family is always there, and the beer is always cold, and the warnings are always funny, and the show never ends. Good night. Wherever you are watching from, whatever time it is where you are, thank you for being here for this. These conversations are only possible because you stay. Sleep well. And when you watch the show again, you will hear it differently. You always will now. That is the whole point. That has always been the whole point. End of script. Total approximate word count to 50,000 plus words. Expansion content, additional passages for each section to be inserted into the full script to reach 40,000 plus words. Expansion for section 1 insert after "we laughed" paragraph. The mechanics of why the warnings went unheard are worth spending real time on because they are not mysterious and they are not accidental. They are the predictable outcome of very specific design choices that the show made deliberately and that produced very specific audience responses. Comedy is the original armor. When something is funny, your defenses lower, your body relaxes. The physiological state of laughter is fundamentally incompatible with the physiological state of alarm. You cannot be fully amused and fully alarmed at the same time, and the show was extraordinarily good at being funny. It was funny with a precision and a consistency that few things in television have ever matched. It was funny in the season 1 way and the season 3 way and the season 8 way, each era of the show having its own specific comedic register while maintaining the essential warmth and the essential craft that made the laughter feel safe. When you laugh at something, you metabolize it. The emotional energy of recognition, which is what the best comedy generates in abundance, gets discharged through the laughter rather than held and examined. The show gives you the recognition, you feel the laugh releases the tension that the recognition created, and you move on to the next moment. The thing you recognized is no longer sitting in you, generating discomfort, demanding a response. It has been processed. It has been handled. The laughter was the handling. This is not a flaw in comedy. It is one of comedy's essential functions. The ability to make painful things bearable by giving them a shape and a sound that allows them to be experienced without being overwhelming is one of the most important things human beings do with language and story and performance. But it means that comedy, as a vehicle for social critique, carries within it the very mechanism that can prevent the critique from producing change. The thing you laugh at is the thing you have discharged. The thing you laugh at most easily is often the thing you are least likely to act on. The Simpsons was aware of this. The show was made by intelligent people who had thought carefully about what they were doing and what it could and could not accomplish. The writer's room was not a room of naive optimists who believed that making Springfield funny would fix Springfield. They were realists about the capacity of comedy to change things, and they chose to make the comedy as good as possible anyway, because the alternative, making something less funny in the hope of making it more urgent, would have sacrificed the audience and the platform along with the laughs. So the trade was accepted. The warnings were wrapped in comedy. The comedy kept the audience. The audience received the warnings. The warnings were funny enough to receive without discomfort, and the discomfort that might have produced action was discharged with the laughter. The second mechanism that kept the warnings at bay was the episodic structure of the show itself. Each episode was complete. Each crisis was introduced, developed, and resolved within a single half hour. The monorail was built and destroyed. The nuclear incident was averted or forgotten. The marriage was threatened and restored. The school lost its funding and found it again through some narrative mechanism. The structural completeness of each episode performed the function of telling the audience that the problem was handled, that it had a shape, that it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, that the credits would roll and the thing would be over and next week would be a new thing. This structural comfort, the comfort of the story that resolves, is one of the deepest pleasures of narrative. It is also one of the most powerful arguments for complacency. Stories that resolve tell you that things resolve. Stories that end tell you that things end. The episodic structure of a half-hour sitcom is one of the most resolution-heavy narrative forms in existence, and The Simpsons used it for 36 years to contain warnings that the real world was never going to resolve in half an hour. The show understood this tension. It was one of the things the show was most self-aware about. The reset button, the way Springfield returned to normal after every catastrophe, was not just a production convenience. It was a statement about the relationship between the stories we tell and the problems we face. Stories end, problems persist. The monorail episode is hilarious and complete, and the monorail is gone by the time the credits roll. But the vulnerability that allowed the monorail to happen, the civic susceptibility to the charismatic pitch, the inadequacy of the information environment, the economic desperation that made a bad deal look attractive. Those things are still there when the credits roll. They will be there for the next monorail. They are structural. They are the conditions, not the event. The show kept putting the conditions in the foreground and resolving the events, and the audience, following the narrative logic of the form, focused on the event. The event resolved. The audience received resolution, and the conditions continued. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, the warnings went unheard because they were warnings about the audience's own situation. This is the hardest kind of warning to hear. External warnings. Warnings about things that are happening to other people in other places are much easier to absorb than internal warnings. Warnings about your own life, your own community, your own role in the system that is being criticized. The Simpsons was very careful to make Springfield feel like your town, not some other town. It was deliberately generic. It was deliberately familiar. The intention was for the viewer to feel at home in Springfield, to recognize their own neighborhood, their own family, their own workplace. And this was the trap. Because if Springfield is your town, then the warnings about Springfield are warnings about your town. And if the warnings are about your town, then hearing the warnings means acknowledging that the things being warned about are things you are living inside. That the economic precarity is your economic precarity. That the environmental compromise is your environmental compromise. That the political failure is your political failure. That the family under pressure is your family under pressure. This acknowledgement is difficult. It requires a quality of honesty with yourself that is genuinely uncomfortable. And the show was so good at making Springfield feel safe, so good at making the characters feel lovable, that the discomfort of the recognition never quite rose to the level where it demanded a response. It stayed at the level of warm, slightly melancholy recognition, the kind you feel when a song captures something you have been feeling without quite having words for it. Beautiful, accurate, transient. There, and then gone. The show moved to the next joke. You moved on. The fourth mechanism is the one that is hardest to talk about without sounding like you are making an accusation, because it is not an accusation. It is just a structural reality about what people can do with information about systemic problems when the systems they would need to engage with in order to address those problems are the same systems they depend on for their daily survival. Most people who watched The Simpsons for 36 years and absorbed its warnings were not in a position to act on them in any way that would have been adequate to their scale. The economic warning was about the structure of the American economy, and most viewers were participants in that economy at a level that gave them very limited leverage over its shape. The environmental warning was about the regulatory relationship between industrial capital and environmental protection, and most viewers were not in positions of regulatory authority. The political warning was about the structural failures of democratic accountability, and most viewers had one vote and limited time and limited access to the kinds of political action that produce structural change. The show knew this. It was always a show about people without power, about the Homers and the Marges and the Lisas and the Barts, not the Burnses. It was always a show about what it was like to be inside a system rather than at the controls of it. And the honesty of that position, the genuine acknowledgement that the people inside the system had limited capacity to change it from inside, was part of what made the show's critique so different from the usual register of political satire. The usual register of political satire implicitly assumes an audience that could, if sufficiently motivated, act on the critique. It assumes that the audience has the power that the critique requires. The Simpsons knew its audience was Homer, and Homer does not have the power that fixing Springfield requires. Homer can barely keep the mortgage current. Homer can barely remember to pick up the children from school on the right day. Homer, when he understood clearly what was happening around him, when the crayon was out and his intelligence was full and he could see Springfield as it actually was, chose to have the crayon put back in. Because the alternative, seeing clearly without the power to change what you see, was too painful to sustain. That is the deepest warning of all. That clarity without agency is its own kind of suffering. That knowing what is wrong and being unable to fix it is an experience with specific psychological costs. That the show was in some ways doing its audience a kindness by wrapping the warnings in comedy, because the comedy made the knowledge bearable in a way that clear, unmediated confrontation with the same facts would not. Springfield is a love letter and a warning and a diagnosis, all at the same time. And the reason it could be all three simultaneously is that it was funny enough to hold you through the parts that hurt. Expansion for Section 2 insert after. And we laughed. Paragraph. The specific geography of financial anxiety that The Simpsons inhabited is worth mapping in some detail, because it is precise in ways that are easy to miss when the comedy is working well. Homer's paycheck arrives and it is insufficient. This is not because Homer is doing something wrong with his money, though Homer does do things wrong with his money. It is because the paycheck is structured to be insufficient. The mortgage, the utilities, the food, the car payments, the children's needs, the medical expenses, the various costs of maintaining a life in Springfield add up to more than the paycheck covers by a margin that is small enough to feel manageable and large enough to be constant. This is not a budget management problem. It is an arithmetic problem. The numbers do not add up, and they have not added up since the show began, and they are never going to add up, because the system that sets the paycheck and the system that sets the costs of the life are not coordinated in a way that produces sufficiency. This gap between income and the cost of maintaining a life that was supposed to be achievable on that income is the core economic anxiety of the American middle and working class for the past 50 years. The gap emerged as wages stagnated, while costs continued to rise. Housing costs rose faster than income. Healthcare costs rose dramatically faster than income. College costs rose dramatically faster than income. The specific basket of goods and services that constituted a middle-class life in 1989 was, by 2024, affordable to a significantly smaller proportion of the population than it had been when Homer first sat down at his reactor. The show understood this gap intuitively and depicted it with consistency. What it perhaps did not fully anticipate was how much wider the gap would get. The financial stress that Homer experienced in 1989 was real. The financial stress that the median American family experienced in 2024 was substantially greater in most of its dimensions. Housing costs as a proportion of income were significantly higher. Healthcare was more expensive relative to income. The college debt burden that the generation after Bart's would carry had become one of the significant structural features of younger Americans' financial lives. But the shape of the problem was the same shape the show had been depicting. Income insufficient for the life it is supposed to support. The gap filled with debt, with deferred maintenance, with the specific creativity of people managing insufficient resources and making them last through a combination of ingenuity and deprivation and the quiet heroism of making do. The show had always known this shape. It had been drawing it, in yellow, for decades. The relationship between Homer's financial situation and his political behavior is also worth examining. Homer does not engage meaningfully with the political processes that could, in theory, address the structural conditions producing his economic situation. He votes occasionally. He attends town meetings when they are exciting enough to be worth attending. But he does not organize. He does not advocate. He does not connect the conditions of his economic life to the political decisions that produced and maintain those conditions. This is not stupidity, exactly. Homer is not a sophisticated political analyst, but the relationship between economic conditions and political disengagement is not primarily about analytical capacity. It is about time, which Homer has limited amounts of, about trust, which Homer has limited reason to extend to institutions that have consistently failed to serve him, and about a specific learned helplessness that develops in people who have invested in the political process and received nothing that improved their material situation. The show depicted Springfieldians voting enthusiastically for things that made their situation worse. The monorail, various Quimby promises, the occasional demagogue who arrived with a compelling solution to Springfield's problems and turned out to be lying. The pattern of voting against self-interest, which political scientists and psychologists have studied extensively, is visible throughout Springfield's political life, and the show's depiction of it is consistent with what the research suggests are its actual causes. It is not that people do not understand their interests. It is that the information environment is inadequate, that the trust necessary for clear political vision has been eroded, that the short-term emotional logic of a charismatic argument overwhelms the long-term calculation of whether the argument is likely to be true. The economic warning is also a warning about the relationship between economic security and democratic capacity. People who are financially secure have the time and energy and trust and stability that genuine civic participation requires. People who are financially precarious have less of all of these things and need their political institutions to be more reliable and more accountable, not less, as a counterweight to the economic vulnerability. But the structural conditions that produce financial precarity also tend to produce political systems that are less accountable, partly because the concentrated interests that benefit from financial precarity in the working class also tend to invest in shaping the political environment in ways that reduce accountability. Springfield's politics are bad for Springfield in the same way that the economics are bad for Springfield. And the economics and the politics are bad in related ways, feeding each other, each making the other worse. Burns's economic power produces political influence. The political influence protects the economic power. The working people of Springfield are paying for this arrangement with their financial security and their democratic agency simultaneously. The show knew this. It built it into the structure of Springfield's social world from the beginning. The plant and the mayor and the police and the media were all in a relationship of mutual support that made accountability to the people of Springfield structurally difficult. And the people of Springfield were working too hard and too anxiously to build the sustained political will to challenge it. That is the economy warning in its most complete form. It is not just about the paycheck, it is about what the paycheck does to the person receiving it. It is about the way economic precarity shapes political capacity, social connection, mental health, family stability, and the basic orientation toward the future that people need in order to act as citizens rather than just as workers and consumers. The paycheck is too small, the cost of living is too high, the gap between them is too wide. And in that gap, the things that make democracy and community and genuine human flourishing possible are slowly being crowded out. That was Springfield. That is America. The show said so. We kept watching. Expansion for Section 5 insert before final paragraph. Burns is still there. The show's treatment of what we might call the ideology of meritocracy is another dimension of the corporate power warning that deserves attention. Springfield consistently depicts a world where the official story about how people end up, where they end up, the story about hard work being rewarded and talent being recognized and the deserving rising to the top, is contradicted by the actual mechanisms that determine who has what. Homer did not end up in Sector 7G because of his qualifications. He ended up in Sector 7G because of a secret deal between his father and his employer, a deal made to cover up a crime, a deal that had nothing to do with Homer's abilities or his choices. Burns did not build his empire because he was the most hardworking or the most talented. He built it from inherited wealth and from a century of decisions that were possible precisely because the wealth insulated him from the consequences that would have stopped anyone without that insulation. The meritocracy story says that people rise on their merits. The Springfield story says that people rise on their relationships and their capital and their access and their timing and 100 other factors that have nothing to do with merit in any clean sense. And the people who do not rise, the people who stay at the level they were born at or who fall below it, are told that this is because of their own limitations, their own choices, their own failure to be what the meritocracy rewards. This story, the meritocracy story, is one of the most powerful, legitimating narratives of contemporary capitalism. It says that the outcomes of the system are fair because they reflect individual merit rather than inherited advantage or structural privilege or simple luck. It says that Burns deserves his empire because he built it. It says that Homer deserves his paycheck because that is what his labor is worth. It asks you not to look at the deal between Grandpa and Burns, at the inherited wealth, at the insider access, at the structural advantages that made the apparent merit possible. It asks you to take the surface at face value. The show knew this was happening. It showed you the deal. It showed you the inherited wealth. It showed you the insider access. It placed the meritocracy story and the actual story in the same frame repeatedly and let you see the distance between them. And it did this. Again, inside comedy, inside a format that made the distance between the official story and the actual story funny rather than enraging. The power of that choice cannot be overstated. The meritocracy story is very difficult to challenge directly because any direct challenge can be deflected by pointing to cases where the story appears to be true. There are people who rose from nothing to something through genuine merit. There are cases where talent and work produced reward. The story survives because it has examples. It just does not have the explanatory power it claims, and the exceptions do not reflect the overall pattern. Comedy can hold the exception and the pattern simultaneously. Comedy can show you Burns being inexplicably preserved and Homer being inexplicably maintained and let you feel the comic gap between the official story and the actual story without having to resolve it into a coherent political argument. The laugh lives in the gap. The gap is where the critique lives. And you do not need to articulate the critique to feel it. You just need to see the gap, to hold it in your mind, to carry it away with you when the episode ends. Burns's empire was built on a specific foundation of advantages, relationships, historical timing, regulatory capture, and a century of compounding that are not visible in the surface story of a successful industrialist. Homer's employment is sustained by a private deal that has nothing to do with the public story of a man who worked his way up to the safety inspector position at a nuclear facility. The distance between the surface story and the actual story is where the corporate power warning lies. It is the same distance in the real world. The surface story of American capitalism says that the billionaire class earned what it has through superior vision, superior work ethic, superior ability to create value. The actual story, which the research on wealth accumulation and corporate power tells, includes inherited advantages, regulatory capture, monopoly rents, the systematic transfer of value from workers to capital owners, and a political environment that has been shaped by concentrated wealth in ways that protect concentrated wealth from the accountability that the meritocracy story says it should not need. Springfield showed you this. Springfield always showed you this. And the specific comedy of watching Burns not know Homer's name, of watching the most powerful person in Springfield fail to register the existence of the person who makes his operation possible, is the most precise comic encapsulation of the corporate power warning that the show ever found. It is also, still, one of the funniest bits in television. That was always the trick. That was always the whole thing. Expansion for Section 8 insert after the Marge's Kitchen paragraph. The question of what the Simpsons family was supposed to be, what the ideal family they were approximating and failing to fully achieve actually looked like, is itself a warning. The post-war American family, the nuclear unit of 2 parents and 2 or 3 children in a house with a yard and a car, was a historical anomaly that was mistaken for a timeless natural form. The specific conditions that produced the post-war American family, the GI Bill, the availability of affordable mortgages, the manufacturing economy that provided stable union wage employment for men without advanced education, the social expectation that women would leave the labor force when they married, the geographic concentration in suburban developments built around the automobile were the product of a very specific historical moment. They were not permanent, they were contingent. They would not last. But the cultural representation of the family that was produced during that period did last, or at least persisted long after the conditions that made it real had dissolved. The family on television continued to look like the post-war family long after the actual families watching television no longer did. The ideal continued to circulate after the conditions that allowed it to be achieved had changed, and the gap between the ideal and the achievable became a source of shame and anxiety, and the specific feeling of failure that attaches to people who are doing their best in impossible conditions, but have internalized an expectation that was never designed for the conditions they are actually in. The Simpsons occupied a strange position in this dynamic. It was the post-war family, formally. The nuclear unit, the house with the yard, the parent at the plant and the parent at home, it had the shape of the ideal. But it also had all the cracks in that shape, all the ways in which the reality of living inside that structure, in the actual conditions of the late 20th century, produced a family that was always under strain, always slightly insufficient, always reaching for something that kept receding as it was approached. The show was both celebrating and eulogizing the American family. It was celebrating it because the family it depicted was lovable and real, and the love inside it was genuine. It was eulogizing it because the conditions that made it possible to sustain even its imperfect version were eroding in real time over the course of the show's run. The single income that could maintain a middle-class household, the job stability that allowed long-term family planning, the affordable housing that made the house with the yard accessible, the community infrastructure that made the neighborhood a real social environment rather than a collection of self-contained households. All of these things were present when the show began, and all of them were less present in significant and documented ways by the show's most recent seasons. The family warning is also a warning about the things that the family is being asked to do that the family cannot do alone. The family is supposed to be the source of emotional support, economic stability, social connection, education, mental health management, and a range of other functions that it is genuinely not equipped to provide by itself. The family is not a social safety net. The family is one unit of a larger social fabric that should include community institutions, public services, accessible healthcare, affordable housing, stable employment, and a range of other infrastructure elements. When those elements are absent or inadequate, the family is left holding the bag for everything, and the family breaks under the weight. Springfield's families are breaking under that weight quietly and consistently throughout the show's run. The show depicts this breaking not as dramatic collapse, but as the slow accumulation of strains and stresses and deferred needs and silences that characterize real family struggle more accurately than dramatic collapse does. The Simpsons do not divorce. They do not have a terrible fracturing event that reorganizes the family in a new configuration. They stay together on the couch, season after season, absorbing the strains of a world that is asking more of them than they can give. That is the warning about the family. That the strains are structural, that they come from the world outside the family rather than from failures of love inside it. That the love is real and the strains are also real, and the two coexist in the specific way that makes The Simpsons both a warm family show and a devastating social document. The family is still on the couch. The strains are still there. The love is also still there. That is exactly the complexity the show was always depicting, exactly the truth it was telling, in the warmest and most honest way it knew how to tell it. Expansion for Section 1. One insert after Moe is wiping down the bar passage. The specific quality of Springfield's loneliness is worth distinguishing from other kinds of loneliness, because it is not the loneliness of people who are isolated. It is the loneliness of people who are together but not quite reaching each other. This is a distinction that research on social connection has been increasingly focused on in recent years. Loneliness is not simply a function of how many people you are around. You can be profoundly lonely in a crowded room. You can be profoundly lonely in a marriage. You can be profoundly lonely in a town full of people you see every day at the Quickie Mart and the school and the bar. The measure of loneliness that matters is not proximity. It is the quality of connection, the degree to which you feel genuinely known and genuinely seen by the people you are with. Springfield residents are in proximity to each other constantly. The town is small. The cast of characters is familiar. Everyone knows everyone in the specific way that small communities generate familiarity, but familiarity is not intimacy. Knowing someone's name in their regular order and the general shape of their life is not the same as knowing them, not in the sense that research on social health identifies as protective against loneliness. The protective connection is the kind that involves mutual vulnerability, reciprocal disclosure, the experience of being held in another person's genuine attention. The people of Springfield are not holding each other in this way. They are performing community, which is different. They are present for the events, the town meetings and the bar nights and the school events, and the civic catastrophes that periodically unite the community around a shared emergency. They are good at the social performance of community membership, and they are privately alone in the specific way of people who have learned to perform community without quite being able to produce it. Lenny and Carl are Homer's closest friends, aside from Barney. They have worked together for years. They are at the bar together regularly. They have shared the background of each other's lives across the entire run of the show. And when you look carefully at their actual relationship, at what they know about each other, at what they say to each other that is genuinely personal rather than generically social, the depth is limited. They are companions. They are not confidants. They are people who have filled the social role of close friend in each other's lives without quite providing the substance that the role is supposed to carry. This is one of the most common forms of adult friendship in the research literature. Adults, particularly adult men, often describe close friends as people they would not describe close friends to an outside observer. They have people they spend time with and people they like and people they could call in a practical emergency. They do not have people they talk to about the things that matter most. They have presence without depth. They have company without genuine connection. The show understood this and depicted it with an affection that made it watchable. Lenny and Carl are warm characters. Their friendship is real in the way that Springfield friendships are real, in the sense that it provides something, some warmth and some regularity and some presence, even if it does not provide everything that genuine friendship provides. And this partial provision is important to acknowledge. It is not nothing. It is significantly better than actual isolation. But it is not what human beings are built to need, and the gap between what it provides and what genuine connection would provide is the gap where the loneliness lives. The community institutions that historically supplemented or generated genuine connection, the churches and civic organizations and community groups that provided structured context for people to know each other in roles that allowed for deeper forms of relationship, have been declining across the period the show has been running. The specific kinds of sustained association that generate genuine friendship, the regular meeting in a fixed context with the same people over time, have been less available to more people as those institutions have weakened. Springfield has institutions. It has the bar and the church and the school and the civic structures. But most of these institutions are depicted as inadequate in the specific ways that generate the Mo problem. They provide proximity without depth. They create context for familiarity without creating conditions for genuine connection. They are shells of the community infrastructure that would be needed to address the loneliness they are surrounded by. The closing of the bar at the end of the night is one of the show's most quietly resonant recurring images. The lights go down. The last customers leave. Mo is alone in the space that is the closest thing he has to a home, surrounded by the evidence of other people's company, about to go home to an apartment that is not the bar, to an evening that is not surrounded by other people's warmth. He has spent his whole day being present for other people's social needs, and he is going home to none of it. This is the service worker's specific version of the loneliness dynamic. The person whose role requires them to be attentive and available and emotionally present for others, who builds their whole professional identity around providing a kind of hospitality that substitutes for what they cannot find for themselves, who at the end of the shift is left with the specific contrast between what they provided and what they have. Mo is not alone in this. A significant proportion of people in service roles, in hospitality and healthcare, and teaching and social work are in some version of Mo's position. They give the care, they go home, they repeat the cycle. The loneliness is structural in their role in a way that is particularly difficult to address. The show loved Mo too much to make him just sad. It gave him the specific comedy of his character, the specific dark humor of a man who has made peace with his disappointments in the specific way of someone who has not quite made peace with them. And in that comedy, in that space between the sadness and the joke, lived the truth about what Springfield's social world was doing to the people inside it. Mo at the end of the night is Springfield's truest image, not Homer on the couch, not Burns in the mansion, Mo alone in the bar, turning off the lights, going home. The community's central social space, empty, the lights out, the quiet complete. That is what the loneliness warning looks like when you take the comedy away for a moment and let it breathe. It looks like a man wiping down a counter after everyone has gone, and it looks exactly like something you have felt before, even if you could not quite name it. End of expansion content. Additional expansion Springfield as America's Mirror. A supplemental section to be placed between Section 11 and the conclusion. Section 11b. The class warning who Springfield thinks it is versus what it is. There is a story that Springfield tells itself about itself. It is the same story that most American communities of its type tell themselves. The story of a middle-class town, a normal town. A town where people are neither rich nor poor, but somewhere in the comfortable middle, where the houses are neither mansions nor hovels, but the particular kind of ordinary that the American dream is supposed to produce and sustain for anyone willing to work for it. Springfield believes it is middle class. The characters believe they are middle class. Homer identifies as middle class. Marge keeps a middle class house. The Simpsons send their children to the public school, drive an ordinary car, take occasional vacations to affordable destinations, and exist inside the specific self-understanding of people for whom the American middle class is not an aspiration but an identity. The show has always been quietly, carefully showing you that this self-understanding is contested by the material reality of the family's situation. Homer is at the plant, and the paycheck keeps the lights on, and the self-conception of middle-class stability floats above the actual arithmetic in a way that requires constant maintenance. The class identity is held together by the house, by the possessions, by the suburban setting, by the performance of normalcy that is itself one of the defining activities of American middle-class life. You perform being middle class. You buy the things that middle-class people buy. You send your children to the schools that middle-class children attend. You live in the neighborhood. You maintain the lawn. The performance is real in the sense that it produces real things, real housing, real education, real community. But underneath the performance is a financial reality that is more precarious than the performance allows. This gap between class identity and class reality is one of the most important and least discussed features of American social life. The United States has an unusually strong attachment to the self-description of middle class. Surveys consistently show that Americans who are objectively in the bottom income quintile and Americans who are objectively in the top income quintile both frequently describe themselves as middle class. The middle class identity has become a kind of universal aspiration and self-description that obscures the enormous variation in actual material circumstances that it encompasses. Springfield is middle class in this specific American sense. It is middle class because it believes itself to be middle class and performs middle class life and exists in the space where middle class self-conception is possible, not because its material conditions are consistently or securely what middle-class life is supposed to provide. The show has also had important things to say about the relationship between class and aspiration in Springfield. The people of Springfield want more than they have. They want it visibly, loudly, in the specific ways of people who are close enough to something better to imagine it, and far enough from it to feel the distance. Homer's periodic fantasies of wealth, his lottery tickets, his business schemes, his moments of imagining a life without the arithmetic anxiety are not character quirks. They are the specific psychology of a person in a class position just precarious enough to generate sustained longing for something more secure. The American dream is a class mobility story. It says that where you start does not have to be where you end, that the next generation can do better, that with work and with luck and with the right choices, you can move up the ladder, can arrive at a place where the arithmetic works without effort, where the paycheck is adequate and the future is secure, and the aspiration of the previous generation has become the settled reality of the present one. Homer and Marge have not moved up the ladder. They are at the same level they started at, or close to it. Bart's educational trajectory does not suggest upward mobility. Lisa's does. But the show has always been honest about the specific costs of Lisa's intelligence, about what it will take for her to move out of Springfield and into a world that can use what she has, and about the distance between where she is and where her gifts could take her if the conditions were right. The class warning in The Simpsons is the warning about the American dream's delivery mechanism. The dream is real as an aspiration. It has always been real as an aspiration. The aspiration is genuine, and the longing is genuine, and the work that people put into trying to realize it is genuine. But the system through which the aspiration is supposed to be realized has been shifting. The ladder has been getting harder to climb, while the distance between the rungs has been getting larger. The number of people who start at Homer's level and arrive somewhere significantly better has been declining. The show knew this. It kept showing you Homer at the same level, season after season, year after year, not because Homer failed to try, but because the trajectory the system offered was not one that led upward. For Homer, in the specific economic environment Springfield depicted, the class position was stable in the way that a position on a treadmill is stable. You could run and not fall behind, but you were not getting anywhere. The people who inhabit Springfield's class landscape below Homer are also visible in the show's background, and the show's treatment of them is one of the more underappreciated aspects of its class awareness. The poor of Springfield are not absent from the show. They are there in the background, in the specific characters who exist at the margin of the community's economic life. See Captain Merriweather, Dr. Nick, the various background characters whose specific economic situations are implied by their roles and contexts. The show is not a show about poverty, but it is a show that keeps poverty visible, that does not allow the middle-class frame to fully exclude the people who are below it. The show also understood that the line between middle-class stability and something worse is thinner than the middle-class self-understanding allows. Homer's position is not securely above the line. It is close to the line. One serious medical event, one job loss, one major financial crisis, and the house, the car, the sense of being middle class, the whole performance, could unravel faster than anyone who has not been that close to the edge quite understands. This is the financial reality of a significant proportion of the people who identify as American middle class. The surveys on financial resilience consistently show that a majority of Americans could not cover an unexpected expense of a few $100s without borrowing. This is middle class in the actual condition, not the self-conception. This is the Homer reality. Close enough to stability to call yourself stable. Close enough to the edge to know it is there. The show put the edge in the frame. It put Burns in the penthouse and Homer in the house that is one crisis away from not being Homer's house. And it lets you see both in the same Springfield, in the same community, separated by the specific distance that the class structure of the American economy produces and maintains. That is the class warning. That the distance between where most people are and where the official story says they should be is real and is growing. That the middle class is not the floor of a comfortable life, but a position that requires constant maintenance and remains perpetually vulnerable to the forces that are organized to compound in the wrong direction. That Burns's world and Homer's world are in the same town and are not getting closer together. Springfield showed you this town. It made it funny. It made it lovable. It made you want to live there. And then it showed you the economics of living there. And those two things were always both true at the same time. Which is why the show was always about more than Springfield. It was always about the town you were actually in. The one that looks exactly like Springfield from the outside, and feels exactly like it from the inside, and never quite makes the arithmetic work, no matter how hard Homer tries, no matter how faithfully Marge manages, no matter how many seasons pass. The plant keeps running, Burns keeps signing the check, and the gap between what the town is and what it tells itself it is stays exactly as wide as it has always been, exactly as wide as the distance between the performance of the American middle class and the reality of living inside it, which is, in the end, the distance between Springfield as the show shows it to you and Springfield as the people inside it experience it. That gap is where the warnings live. That gap is where the show has always been speaking from, not from above it, from inside it, from the couch, from the kitchen, from Sector 7G, from the place where you already are, where we have always been, where the warnings have always been true, even when they were funny, especially when they were funny. End of section 11b. Additional expansion, the friendship warning, and male vulnerability. The men of Springfield have a specific relationship to one another that the show renders with a precision that social researchers would find familiar. They are together. They are loyal, in the specific way of people who have been in each other's company for long enough that the loyalty has become structural rather than chosen. Homer would go to considerable lengths for Lenny and Carl, not because he has examined his relationship with them and determined they are worth the effort, because they are the people who are there. They are the furniture of his social world, and loyalty to the furniture of your social world is one of the most consistent features of male friendship across cultures. But the specific content of what Homer, Lenny, and Carl share with each other is almost entirely contained within the domain of shared activity and shared presence. They drink together, they work together, they complain about work together, they watch sports together on occasion. They are present in each other's lives through the consistent appearance of each in the places the others regularly occupy. And when something significant happens in one of their lives, the quality of support that the others provide is warm but essentially surface level. They do not go deep with each other. The depth is not available. The scripts for going deep are not part of the friendship's vocabulary. This is not a character flaw in Homer or Lenny or Carl specifically. It is the specific limitation of friendships built on shared activity and mutual presence rather than on the kind of intentional, deliberate, emotional engagement that closer friendships require. And it is an extremely common limitation in adult male friendships specifically for reasons that are well documented and that connect directly to the cultural scripts around masculinity that the show has always navigated with a mixture of affection and critique. Men in American culture are given very limited permission to be vulnerable with each other. The cultural scripts around male friendship emphasize shared activities, mutual competence, humor as a substitute for emotional disclosure, and a specific kind of loyalty that manifests as showing up rather than opening up. These scripts are not universal. They vary across cultural contexts and across individuals, but they are pervasive enough to shape the default expectations that most American men bring to their friendships, and those default expectations tend to produce friendships that are genuinely warm and genuinely insufficient in the specific ways the Springfield men's friendships are insufficient. The show has always known this. It has depicted Homer's social world with an accuracy about the texture of working-class male friendship that feels observed rather than invented. The bar is real. The dynamics at the bar are real. The specific quality of comfort that comes from being in the presence of people who know your face and your order and the general outlines of your life, without requiring anything from you that you are not equipped to give, is real, and it is not nothing. It provides something. It provides a low-stakes form of belonging that is better than isolation, even if it is significantly less than genuine connection. The question the show keeps asking without quite verbalizing is what it would take for Homer to have a different kind of friendship. What would it require for the bar to become a place where the real things were said, where the interior life was shared, where the specific weight of being Homer was something that could be set down for a moment in the company of someone else who was carrying their own version of the same weight? The answer the show implies is that it would require Homer to be a different kind of person in a different kind of culture. The resources for that kind of friendship are there, somewhere, in Homer's emotional interior. The show has given you glimpses of them. Homer in his best moments, the moments when he is fully present with Marge, or with one of his children, is a person of considerable warmth and considerable emotional depth. The depth is there. The access to the depth in the context of male friendship is not, because the friendship context does not ask for it, and Homer has not built the habit of offering what is not being asked for. This is the friendship warning. The warning about the specific cost of male emotional culture, the way the cultural scripts around what men are supposed to need and supposed to provide in their relationships with each other produce a kind of structured insufficiency, a quality of companionship that is genuine but incomplete in ways that accumulate over a lifetime into something that looks a lot like what the research on male loneliness describes. The research is consistent. Men in the United States report fewer close friends than women. They report lower satisfaction with the depth of their friendships. They report less comfort with vulnerability in friendship contexts. They are less likely to disclose emotional difficulty to their friends. They are less likely to seek out the specific kind of support that requires another person to be genuinely present with your actual interior experience, rather than with the version of you that shows up at the bar. Homer is at the bar? Homer will always be at the bar? The bar is where the men of Springfield are, together and not quite together, present and not quite reached, loyal to each other in the ways they have been taught to be loyal, and unable to provide for each other the things that the research says would actually help. That is the friendship warning. That is what Moe's Tavern has been showing you. Not just the comedy of the bartender and his regulars, the specific shape of what men are given as a substitute for connection, and what it costs them that the substitute is not the real thing. Additional expansion, the nostalgia warning. The Simpsons has always had a particular relationship with the past, not with history in the academic sense, but with the personal past, with the way memory constructs the version of things that provides the frame for the version of things that are. The show has engaged with this throughout its run, particularly in its treatment of the characters' backstories, their formative experiences, the things that made them who they are, and that continue to operate inside them in ways they often do not fully understand. But there is a specific kind of nostalgia that the show has been circling for 36 years without quite naming it. It is the nostalgia that American popular culture has been metabolizing and remetabolizing since at least the 1970s, the nostalgia for a version of American life, specifically the post-war suburban American life of the 1950s and early 1960s, that has been elevated to the status of a cultural ideal even as the conditions that produced it have dissolved. The Springfield that Homer inhabits is in some ways a permanent 1950s. Not literally. The show is temporally anchored to its moment of production in the ways we have discussed, floating with the present rather than fixed in a historical decade. But the structure of Springfield's social world, the stay-at-home mother and the breadwinning father, and the nuclear family in the house with the yard and the neighbors who are also ordinary families, is the structure of the post-war suburban ideal that was built in the specific economic and social conditions of the immediate post-war period, and has been the measure against which American family life has been compared ever since. The nostalgia warning is about what it costs to use this ideal as the standard. The conditions that produced it were specific and non-repeatable. The GI Bill, the manufacturing economy, the specific demographic conditions of the immediate post-war years, the social compacts around labor and housing and education that were in place in that moment, are not simply going to return because they are desired. They were the product of specific political choices made in specific historical circumstances that no longer exist, but the ideal persists. And the gap between the ideal and what is achievable in the actual economic and social conditions of the present generates a specific kind of suffering. It generates the experience of failure, the sense that something is wrong with you or with your circumstances, when the actual problem is that you are being measured against a standard that was never sustainable outside the conditions that briefly made it possible. Homer and Marge are trying to live up to a version of family life that the economy of their actual historical moment cannot consistently support. The house, the one income, the stay-at-home parent, the neighborhood community, these things are possible for them because the show allows them to be possible. Because the show is set in a cartoon town that can maintain things the real world is withdrawing. But the strain is always there, in the way it always is when you are trying to sustain something that the material conditions of your life are not organized to support. The nostalgia for a better past, whether that past is real or imagined or significantly more complicated than the version being longed for, is one of the most powerful political forces in contemporary American life. It animates a specific kind of political sensibility organized around the desire to return to something that seems to have been lost. The Simpsons has always understood this longing from the inside, has always depicted it in the warm but slightly melancholy register that characterized the show's emotional palette. Homer's longing for simpler times. Abe Simpson's stories about a past that may never have been quite what he remembers, but that provides the frame for his experience of the present, where everything that was better has been lost. The recurring episodes where Springfield briefly recaptures something that felt like the ideal before it dissolves back into the actual. These are all engagements with the nostalgia dynamic, all ways of depicting the gap between the world people carry in their memory and aspiration and the world they actually inhabit. The warning in this is not that nostalgia is bad. Nostalgia is human. The attachment to the past, to the things that felt better or simpler or more complete, is not a pathology. It is a feature of how memory and longing work in human beings. The warning is about what happens when nostalgia becomes the primary frame through which the present is judged, when the standard against which the current moment is measured is a past that may be significantly more complicated than the version being remembered, and when the political energy generated by that nostalgia is directed at restoring conditions that cannot be restored because the conditions that produce them are gone. The Simpsons has been sitting in this tension for 36 years. It has been a show that looks backward, that is organized around the structure of an ideal that belongs to a specific historical moment, while also being relentlessly present in its engagement with the actual conditions of the world the characters are navigating. The tension between these two orientations, between the backward-looking ideal and the forward-pressing reality, is one of the things that gives the show its specific emotional texture. It is warm with the warmth of remembered things and honest with the honesty of observed things, and the two qualities are in permanent, productive tension with each other. The nostalgia warning says, the thing you are missing may not be what you think it is. The ideal family, the ideal community, the ideal America that is being measured against and found wanting may be a construction rather than a reality, a memory that is more wish than documentary, an aspiration that was always more complicated than its representation, and the energy spent on recovering something that may never have fully existed is energy that is not being spent on building something that can actually work in the conditions that actually exist. Springfield cannot go back to 1955. The show knows this, but it also knows why the people inside Springfield want to. It knows what the longing is about. It knows that the longing is real even if the object of the longing is partially constructed. And it holds that knowledge with compassion rather than contempt, with the specific gentleness of a show that loves the people it is depicting, even when it is being honest about the things those people cannot quite see. That is the final texture of the warning. Not condemnation, not mockery, just honesty, in the warmest possible register, about the gap between what we want the world to be and what it is, about the things we reach for that are not quite there, about the family on the couch in the house that keeps the mortgage current, in the town that is running out of ways to maintain what it has always been, reaching for something, still trying, still there, the plant still running behind them, the sky still the specific yellow of Springfield's perpetual twilight, the warning still in every frame. Still funny, still true, still ours. End of additional expansion. Supplemental on the act of watching. There is something worth saying about what it means to watch The Simpsons at this particular moment in time, specifically in the context of everything we have walked through in this video. You are watching this, probably, in a room that is somewhat like the Simpson living room. You have a screen in front of you. You are comfortable, or at least not uncomfortable. The things of your daily life are temporarily set aside. The tasks and the responsibilities and the particular arithmetic of your own version of The Simpsons' financial situation are, for the duration of this video, not the active foreground. You are watching. This is the same position that Homer occupies relative to his television. This is the same position that everyone watching The Simpsons has always occupied. The posture of the viewer. The posture of someone who has, for a defined period of time, chosen to receive rather than to do. There is nothing wrong with this posture. Rest is necessary. Entertainment is necessary. The specific pleasure of watching something well made and letting it wash over you is a real pleasure that does not require defense. The warnings we have been discussing are not a case against watching television or against enjoying The Simpsons. The show is made to be enjoyed. The enjoyment is the point. But it is worth holding, alongside the enjoyment, the awareness of what the show has been showing you. The awareness that the living room you are sitting in is not entirely unlike the living room on screen. That the warnings the show has been issuing across its entire run are warnings about the world you are actually in, about the forces shaping your life in the same ways they have been shaping Homer's. That the comedy and the warmth and the craft and the love that make the show worth watching are also the delivery mechanism for something serious that you are fully capable of receiving, right now, in the posture of the viewer. You do not have to do anything with it tonight. The show never asked you to act on the warnings in any specific way. The show just asked you to see them, to let them register, to carry them with you when you walk out of Springfield and back into the world the show was always about. The seeing is enough. The seeing is actually quite a lot. Homer has been showing you his life for 36 years. All he ever asked was that you pay attention. He just wanted to be seen. That was always the deepest thing about Homer. That was always the deepest thing about the show. The man who worked at the plant and came home to his family and ate his donuts and watched his television and stumbled through his life with a combination of catastrophic incompetence and absolute love that somehow, impossibly, always managed to be enough. He was showing you something real. All along, you were watching. That is not nothing. That